Welcome to quiet Ember sleep. Soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Tonight, we return to Baker Street in winter, to long, unhurried Sherlock Holmes journeys, told not to startle the mind awake, but to ease it gently toward rest. Before we step through that familiar doorway, tell me, where in the world are you listening from this evening? I read every message and love to hear where my audience is listening from. Now settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. As the evening draws in, the little insistences of modern life can be allowed to step politely back. Screens that have been bright and demanding all day can fade to a dim, distant glow. Messages that have chimed and stacked themselves into tidy towers of obligation can drift toward the edge of your awareness, like letters placed in a tray to be answered tomorrow. To-do lists can fold themselves neatly and without complaint, and slide into a drawer. In their place, you might imagine the steady ticking of a Victorian clock on the mantel, a sound so regular and so reasonable that it seems to keep time not only for the room, but for your breathing as well. Outside, instead of traffic and notifications, there is the muffled sound of carriage wheels on snow-softened streets, hooves striking a quiet rhythm that London never entirely surrenders, even under fog and frost. Inside, there is the small clink of a spoon against a teacup, the faint rustle of newspaper, the low murmur of a city held at bay by brick walls and thick curtains. This is the kind of silence that is not empty, but companionable, the sort of silence that can carry you toward peaceful sleep if you choose to follow it. And now, with your body a little heavier, your breath a little slower, let us walk together in imagination along that familiar narrow street, the gas lamps haloed in fog, the upper window of 221B showing a square of fire-lit glow. We climb the worn steps, feel the polished banister under our fingertips, and pause at the door. When it opens, there is the soft chime of the bell, the immediate comforting scent of tobacco, paper, and polished wood, and the sense that we are expected. Somewhere within, Holmes is about to look up, Watson is about to close his book, and the letter that claims to know the future is waiting on the table between them. The door closes softly behind us, and at once the world narrows to the small, familiar universe of Baker Street on a winter's night, where the city's cares seem to pause respectfully on the stair, and the air itself has learned to move in a quieter way. Settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind stand for a moment on that worn threshold, looking in. The fog has followed us this far, pressing its pale face against the sitting room window, the glass filmed with a faint breath of moisture that blurs the yellow halos of the gas lamps along Baker Street into soft, trembling stars. Outside, the snow has begun in earnest, not in any dramatic flurry, but in a patient, sifting fall that gathers on window ledges, rounds the sharp edges of the railings, and lays a thin, bright powder across the cobblestones, so that the passing of a late hansom leaves two dark, slow-fading tracks in its wake. Inside, the room holds a different weather. The coal fire in the grate breathes with a steady, gentle rhythm, each quiet collapse of embers sending up a brief pulse of deeper warmth that you can almost feel on your hands if you rest them, in imagination, toward the glow. The flames throw their light over the familiar disorder of Holmes's possessions: chemical glassware crowding the mantel, a violin case half open on the side table, newspapers in drifts and layers as though some private wind had blown only headlines and telegrams. A pair of cooling teacups sits on the low table, the faintest porcelain clink sounding whenever the house settles. The air is thick with those small domestic scents that seem to belong only to this address, the blue curl of pipe tobacco that has sunk into the books and the curtains, the dry, slightly sweet aroma of old leather from Watson's medical bag by the chair, the clean tang of coal smoke from the fire, and somewhere beneath it all, the ghost of London's winter fog, politely kept at bay. The curtains hang heavy and dark at the window, not merely fabric, but quiet guardians holding back the cold, while the fog outside behaves like a curious creature, nosing at the glass, trying to peer in at the circle of light. On the mantel, the clock observes it all with patient composure, its ticking a soft metronome in the layered silence, counting out the seconds with the same calm impartiality whether Holmes is in the height of deduction or, as tonight, Watson, in his accustomed chair, feels the particular comfort of this room settle over him, that sense of being held in a small, warm harbor, while the sea of the city rolls and mutters unseen below. These are soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, he reflects, as he closes his book and listens to the fire. Breathe with me as we begin to notice the quiet contrasts, the crisp little draft that slips in at the edge of the window frame, touching the back of Watson's neck, and then the answering weight of heat from the coals, the far-off jingle of harness in the street, and then the deeper, enclosing silence when it fades. London, for once, seems to be speaking in a whisper, as if aware that somewhere above its snow-dusted roofs, a mind is resting between problems and should not yet be disturbed. And yet, even on such an evening, when the fog is gentle, the snow is soft, and the fire burns low with the contentment of a room that believes itself unobserved, something is already on its way through that quiet city. A letter traveling from sorting office to postman's bag, from gloved hand to brass tray, carrying with it a future that has not yet happened. In a few minutes, there will be a knock at the door, and the peaceful silence of 221B will tilt almost imperceptibly toward the impossible promise waiting inside that sealed envelope. Inside, the room held its usual well-worn warmth, the kind that seems to rise not only from coal and flame, but from years of repeated gestures and quiet conversations, from evenings that resemble one another so closely they blur into a single, comforting memory. Settle in, get comfortable, and you might almost see it with Watson's own eyes. The familiar curve of the hearth, the sagging armchair by the fire, and occupying his accustomed sphere like a planet in slow, precise orbit, Sherlock Holmes himself. On this particular winter evening, Holmes had taken possession of the sofa, stretched at full, languid length, his dressing gown a soft, dark pool against the faded upholstery. One arm folded behind his head, while the other balanced a pipe with that incongruous elegance that could make even tobacco seem an instrument of thought. The snow beyond the window lent the glass a pale fogged glow, so that his profile, when he turned his head, was briefly etched against it, a quiet silhouette framed by frost and firelight, as if the city outside were only a painted backdrop to the theater of Baker Street. Watson, ensconced in his own chair with a medical journal that he had not truly read in 20 minutes, watched his friend with the affectionate, slightly amused attention of a man who has seen the same scene 100 times and never quite tires of it. There was the familiar ritual, the precise way Holmes tamped the tobacco down with the pad of one long finger. Never hurried, never wasteful, giving to that simple act the same exactitude he might devote to arranging railway timetables or aligning a chemical experiment. The pipe bowl glowed, dimmed, then glowed again, in rhythm with his thoughts. From the corner, his violin rested against its chair, and now and then Holmes would reach out with the bow, not to play, but to tap, once, twice, against a single string, producing a soft, questioning note that hung in the air and then dissolved into the surrounding silence. Those tiny sounds seemed to Watson like the punctuation marks of Holmes's inner monologue, for he had learned, over their shared years beneath this roof, to recognize the particular stillness that meant his friend's mind had turned inward, slipping away from the room, the fire, even from the good, solid comfort of late Victorian upholstery. It amused Watson, in a gentle way, to note how completely Holmes could ignore the domestic world even as he inhabited it. The tea tray, which Mrs. Hudson had deposited with resigned patience, stood half usurped by a squat glass retort, its cloudy contents occupying the precise spot where a plate of biscuits ought to have been. A small drift of correspondence had colonized the sugar basin, and on the mantelpiece, between the clock and the Persian slipper, lay a railway timetable folded into a shape that suggested it had been used as a bookmark, a coaster, and possibly an impromptu filter paper. Any other man, Watson reflected, would have been accused of untidiness. In Holmes, it was simply the natural overflow of a mind that treated the entire room as an extension of its own filing system. Yet for all the apparent idleness of his pose, Watson knew with the certainty born of 100 cases, that Holmes's intelligence never truly slept. There was always that quick, bright watchfulness behind the half-closed eyes, that faint tightening at the corner of the mouth when some invisible thread of reasoning tugged at his attention. Breathe with me as we begin to linger in this moment. The fire murmuring softly, the city muffled beneath snow, the two men wrapped in companionable silence, each in his place, each following the grooves of an evening pattern laid down long ago. Watson turned a page he would not remember later. Holmes exhaled a ribbon of blue smoke toward the ceiling, and time seemed to slow, as if the very clock on the mantel had agreed to these soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts. It was, to all appearances, an ordinary winter night at 221B Baker Street, the kind that could carry you toward peaceful sleep with nothing more dramatic than the settling of coals in the grate. And yet, even as they sat wrapped in that tranquil routine, a faint sound began to separate itself from the deeper silence of the house. The creak of a stair, the distant movement in the hallway, that subtle change in the air which Watson, though he could not yet name it, would later remember as the instant before the future knocked upon their door. The creak faded, leaving the room in that peculiar listening stillness that old houses sometimes adopt, as if the very walls were waiting to hear what would happen next. Inside the familiar square of their sitting room, however, life had settled into one of those quiet, companionable arrangements that Watson, more than Holmes, had learned to treasure. He sat in his favorite armchair by the fire, the leather molded to his shoulders by years of evenings just like this, his feet stretched toward the soft glow of the coals, an Afghan rug draped with comforting weight across his knees. In his hand lay a medical journal, folded back upon itself, though his eyes had long since drifted from an article on new antiseptic methods to the more absorbing spectacle of Holmes at the opposite side of the room. Lean and intent in his chair by the window, a dark silhouette against the pale blur of London fog. If you settle in, get comfortable, you might almost see it with him. The small table between them with its scattered newspapers, the untouched cup of now cool tea at Watson's elbow, the thin blue ribbon of smoke curling from Holmes's pipe and hanging beneath the ceiling like a private weather system. The fire whispered and shifted, the clock on the mantel marked the minutes with a decorous tick, and from somewhere below came the faint rattle of crockery as Mrs. Hudson brought the day's labors to a close. Watson, in these moods, was conscious of a deep, steady contentment, a kind of quiet gratitude that such evenings existed at all between the storms that so often swept through Baker Street. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, how quickly a telegram or a knock could transform this room from domestic refuge into the antechamber of danger and pursuit. And so he let his gaze linger on the ordinary details that Holmes's restless mind would pass over. The way Mrs. Hudson had folded the napkins upon the tray, each one turned in a neat little triangle, as if she were saluting the day's end. The faint, intermittent rattle of the window when the wind moved in the street outside. The polished shine on Holmes's violin case, catching just enough firelight to suggest recent use. He smiled to himself, a private, almost secret expression. Already some part of him was shaping the evening into sentences, fitting the soft, unremarkable moments into the larger pattern of their shared history. How would he begin, he wondered, when he came to set it down? It was on a night of particular stillness in Baker Street, when the fire burned low and my friend's spirits were at their most inward, that the future first announced itself by way of an envelope. The thought amused him. Holmes would no doubt raise an eyebrow at such embroidery, yet he never objected when the published accounts appeared. These were the instants, Watson knew, that gave meaning to the more dramatic hours, the quiet interludes of firelight and shared silence, of rustling paper and the soft clink of a pipe against a porcelain ashtray, that made their home a place rather than merely a base of operations. They were, in their way, the soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, and he felt that simply sitting there, breathing the warm, slightly smoky air, might carry you toward peaceful sleep more effectively than any opiate a chemist could provide. And yet, even as he savored it, something in the atmosphere shifted. It was nothing he could have defended in words, only a faint tightening of the silence, a sense that the house itself had drawn breath and was holding it. The fire seemed to listen. The window gave a single, tentative rattle and then stilled. Watson lowered his journal, heart beating a fraction faster, and found himself glancing, almost against his will, toward the door, as though expecting at any moment the sound of a foot upon the stair, or the quiet, decisive knock that so often carried the future in its hand. Later he would swear that he had felt it before it came. That subtle expectancy in the room, like the pause before a conductor's baton falls. For now, he only sat a little straighter, the Afghan rug warm across his knees, and waited without quite knowing that he was waiting at all. The sound came first not as a knock, but as a murmur from the house itself, a soft yielding of old wood somewhere below, the almost apologetic creak of a board in the hallway, followed by the faint, metallic kiss of the front door settling back against the wind. Then a small pause in which the silence of the room seemed to listen, and the fire, with impeccable timing, chose that moment to sigh and rearrange itself. Watson, half drowsing yet oddly alert, heard the whisper of movement on the stair, that distinct rustle of skirts which no male footfall could ever quite imitate. A measured swish and pause, as if the very steps of Baker Street had learned the cadence of their landlady long ago and were content to echo it. He had learned over their years of friendship and shared lodgings to recognize the particular quality of silence that preceded one of Holmes's announcements. Now, curiously, the same expectant hush seemed to precede Mrs. Hudson herself. The knock, when it came at last upon the sitting-room door, was neither timid nor insistent, but possessed instead that air of inevitability which attaches itself to the striking of a clock or the turning of the tide. One could almost believe, Watson reflected, that Holmes's cases were not so much summoned as scheduled, each destined to arrive at its appointed hour upon some unseen timetable of fate, as reliable as the postal deliveries that stitched London's days together. "Come in," Holmes said, very quietly. Mrs. Hudson entered with the small bustle of warmth that always accompanied her, bringing with her a thread of cooler air from the stair and the reassuring scent of black tea and starch. She paused just inside the room, smoothing her apron with hands made capable by years of managing both lodgings and lodgers, a faint pink in her cheeks from the drafty hall and the climb. In one hand she balanced a diminutive silver tray, polished to a soft gleam, its surface barely large enough for the solitary object it bore. "Post for you, Mr. Holmes," she observed, in the tone of one who announces nothing remarkable and yet cannot quite disguise a quiet curiosity. The letter, if letter it could be called, lay alone upon the tray, a single envelope of thick, good paper, the sort a careful stationer might recommend for wills or formal invitations rather than ordinary bills. Watson's gaze, always slower than Holmes's but no less sincere, took in the details, the crisp, exact fold, the way the paper held its shape, resisting the slight curve of the tray, the unfamiliar hand on the address, firm and slanting, with just enough flourish in the capitals to suggest education without vanity. No stamp bore the scars of foreign travel. No forwarding marks smudged the surface. It might have stepped out of the fog and climbed the stair on its own. Holmes reached for it with those long, nervous fingers Watson knew so well, the firelight catching on the pale skin as the envelope passed from silver to flesh. For an instant it rested there, unopened, a small, silent weight that nevertheless seemed to tilt the balance of the room, as if the very air tightened a fraction around their chairs. "Curious," Holmes murmured, not yet breaking the seal. "It appears, Watson, that tonight's quiet may have been merely the preface." Watson felt, quite distinctly, that gentle tightening in his chest which meant his sleep would be delayed, and welcomed it. For if a letter could climb the stair with such ceremony, what, he wondered, would its contents do once they were finally set free? Holmes did not at once open the envelope. Instead, he turned it over in his long, nervous fingers, as a man might weigh some curious shell washed up from an unknown sea, its quiet surface giving no hint of the depths from which it had risen. The lamplight fell gently across the paper, and Watson, watching with the comfortable certainty that his own eyes would miss half of what Holmes saw, noticed only that it seemed thick and rather smooth. Holmes, however, narrowed his gaze. The envelope, a soft cream rather than stark white, possessed that faint, velvety drag which spoke of a better class of stationer. When he tilted it toward the fire, a watermark appeared, not boldly, but like a shy signature beneath the surface. A small coronet above an intertwined pair of letters. The room held its usual warmth and cluttered silence. Yet in that moment a simple act of turning paper under the light felt almost ceremonial. He lifted it closer to his face, and the movement stirred a whisper of scent into the air. It was not the familiar fog-laden odor of Baker Street, nor the straightforward reek of London coal smoke alone, but something layered, the ghost of railway soot, a trace of river damp, and just discernible, an unfamiliar cologne, cool and citrus at first impression, with a darker, woody note that lingered. "Our correspondent," Holmes murmured, more to himself than to Watson, "does not purchase his envelopes by the penny packet in the high street." On the upper right corner, the stamp sat in a neat diagonal, and here Holmes's attention sharpened further. The red halfpenny and green penny, slightly misaligned, bore the clear impression of a London postmark. Watson could make out the district and the date, but the time code, a small letter and figure combination, meant little to him beyond its existence. To Holmes, who had more than once reconstructed an entire evening from the hour at which a letter must have left a pillar box, it was plainly a small clock printed in ink. In Victorian London, the post did not merely carry words. With its multiple deliveries, it carried opportunities, alibis, and, for the imaginative, the illusion of prophecy itself. Watson's gaze dropped to the address. The hand was small, the letters upright and evenly spaced, with a certain care in the loops and crossings. One might almost call it feminine, he ventured, though there is a firmness there that suggests a practiced correspondent. Not hurried, at any rate. He felt, as he spoke, that familiar, half-sheepish awareness that his impressions would shortly be rearranged. Holmes smiled, the expression no more than a slight deepening at the corners of his mouth. "You are not entirely astray, Watson. It is a hand which has been schooled to neatness, perhaps in an office where ledgers must be legible, yet the pressure on the downstrokes is uneven, indicating a writer who is, at this moment, under some strain. Note the faint feathering where the ink has spread. An iron gall composition, common enough, but of a quality suggesting a decent if not extravagant bottle. Our unknown friend writes with care, but not with leisure. For a heartbeat, he simply held the envelope, and the room seemed to wait with him. The fire gave a soft sigh as a coal settled. The window showed only its rectangle of blackness, and Watson became acutely aware of the small domestic details that so often preceded their larger adventures. The ink, the paper, the punctual rattle of the postman's tread on the step. How many mysteries, he wondered, had first announced themselves not with a cry in the night, but with the quiet thud of an envelope upon the mat. Here the pattern shifted. Instead of one of his swift, decisive gestures, Holmes traced the edge of the flap with a fingertip, as though measuring not merely the gum and seal, but the intention behind them. "Watermarks, ink, postal schedules," he said softly. "They are to this century what footprints were to the last. We shall see, I think, whether our letter aspires to know the future or merely to manipulate the present. Settle in. Get comfortable, Watson." I might have said had I been narrating aloud, for even in recollection I feel that gentle tightening of curiosity in my chest. In truth, I only leaned a little closer in my chair, the better to see. Holmes broke the seal with a careful thumb, the sound surprisingly loud in the quiet room, and unfolded the single sheet within. The paper crackled softly, a small, intimate thunder between them. His gray eyes moved down the first lines, and though his face scarcely altered, Watson saw his brows lift by the smallest fraction, as if some expected pattern had just failed to appear. It was enough. He felt himself, quite irresistibly, drawn forward, as though the fire itself had leaned in to listen, and the night outside the window had pressed closer to the glass. "Ah," Holmes said at last, in a tone that was neither surprise nor satisfaction, but something more thoughtful. "This, Watson, is unusual." He did not yet read a word aloud, and so, in that suspended instant, with the letter open but its voice withheld, the mystery in their quiet room deepened, and the future, it seemed, had already taken a seat by the fire, waiting to be acknowledged. Breathe with me as we begin to follow it, for these are soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, and perhaps carry you toward peaceful sleep, even as we lean closer to the impossible promise of an envelope from tomorrow. The silence lengthened until it seemed the very fog at the window was listening, And then Holmes, with that small, almost apologetic inclination of the head that meant a decision had been reached, lifted the single sheet and began to read. His voice was even, almost conversational, the same tone he might have used to observe that the fire required another piece of coal, yet the words themselves moved through the quiet room with a different temperature, as if a colder current had found its way beneath the door. On Thursday next, he read, "As the clocks of London stand between 8 and 9 in the evening, Sir Edwin Markham will meet his death in the library of the Reform Club, a book in his left hand and a glass of brandy untasted at his right. He will say, just before the end, 'I had not thought it would be you.'" Watson, watching from his armchair, registered first the domestic details, the club, the hour, the familiar English comfort of book and brandy, before his mind caught up with the simple, terrible assertion that this was written of a moment which, by any sane reckoning, did not yet exist. The fog pressed its soft weight against the glass. The clock on the mantel ticked with unhurried composure. Somewhere below, a cab passed, its wheels whispering over damp stone, as if the city itself declined to be impressed by prophecy. Holmes read on, the letter's calm certainty never faltering. It named the precise room at the Reform, described the green-shaded lamps, the long table beneath the window, even the leather of the armchair in which Sir Edwin was said to sit, and concluded with a note of quiet finality. Nothing may prevent this, though much may be misunderstood by those who come after. There was no flourish, no plea, only that unnerving composure one hears in a man who is very sure of his facts. "Remarkable," Holmes murmured at last, not in admiration, but as a physician might pronounce upon an unusual symptom. He turned the page slightly so that the light fell full upon the ink, and Watson felt, rather than saw, the subtle tightening of his friend's posture. "You observe, Watson," he said, "that the writer has been at some pains to mimic my own hand." Watson rose, the better to see, and found himself looking down at characters so closely resembling Holmes's usual script that for a soft, disorienting instant he experienced the odd sensation that his friend had somehow written to himself from another day. The familiar sharp angles, the economical loops, even certain turns of phrase, "You will observe," those who come after, had been copied with a care that was almost intimate. It was, Watson reflected, one thing to receive a letter from the future, and quite another to find that the future had borrowed your companion's pen. His rational mind, trained by years of medicine and the army and the small, stubborn realities of human frailty, balked at the idea of any true foretelling. The Victorian post could be astonishingly swift. Timetables and clubs and titled gentlemen were all things that might be studied in advance. Yet the precision of the details, the naming of a man of some standing, a club whose very windows Watson could picture, and above all, those supposed last words, settled uneasily upon him, like a coat that did not quite fit, but could not easily be shrugged off. Was it mere manipulation? Some elaborate jest, or a scheme with darker, quieter intentions concealed beneath its surface? Holmes, meanwhile, seemed less troubled than intrigued. He let the page rest against his fingers, feeling perhaps the texture of the paper, the slight give where the ink had pooled, the faint impression of pressure left by an unfamiliar hand pretending to be his own. "Settle in, get comfortable, Watson," he said softly, with that wry little smile that appeared when a case promised more than met the eye. "We are asked to consider, it seems, whether the future has paid us a call, or whether an old acquaintance, the past, has merely changed its hat." He folded the letter with slow care, the crackle of the paper loud in the otherwise gentle silence of the room, and placed it upon the mantel as one might set down a clock that had not yet begun to tick. In my experience, he added, eyes on the quiet envelope, the future is merely the past in disguise. Our task, my dear fellow, is to decide whose past is seeking to dress itself so fashionably. Breathe with me as we begin, for behind this little performance in ink there lies either a crime already conceived or a coincidence so elaborate that I confess I should sleep less soundly if I believed in it. The fire shifted, sending a brief tongue of warmth into the room, and Watson felt that subtle tightening in the air that always preceded their first move. Somewhere, at the Reform Club, a library lamp would soon be lit. Somewhere, Sir Edwin Markham, unaware, would be finishing his day. Between them lay a letter that knew too much, and the quiet question of whether knowledge could ever truly run ahead of its own cause, a question that would carry us, gently but inexorably, toward the next turn of the mystery, and, perhaps, carry you toward peaceful sleep even as the clock of the story moves closer to 8. Holmes did not speak at once. He moved instead to the hearth, that familiar silhouette between armchair and mantelpiece, and stood with his back to the fire so that the soft glow climbed the line of his shoulders and turned the edges of his profile to a kind of quiet copper. The letter hanging loosely from his fingers while his gaze rested somewhere beyond the fogged window and the cramped little room in Baker Street. The coals settled with a gentle sigh, and in that pause I found myself breathing more slowly, as if the silence itself invited one to settle in, get comfortable, and simply watch him think. The world, he said at last, is prodigal in its prophecies, Watson, and remarkably stingy in their fulfillment. His tone was mild, almost conversational, yet the words carried that inward edge I had come to recognize. Men will credit a newspaper horoscope that could apply equally to a stockbroker, a sailor, or a scullery maid, and yet doubt the plain evidence of their own eyes. Prediction, as it is commonly practiced, relies less upon glimpses of the future than upon the soft clay of human credulity, the convenient elasticity of time, and a careful arrangement of circumstances that only appear marvelous when viewed after the event. Dad. He turned the envelope over once, studying its worn corner as a naturalist might consider a leaf. A letter that foretells a crime to the very minute, he went on, is not a message from the unseen. It is a timetable. Our anonymous correspondent wagers that if he can control the hour and the conditions, the world will supply the awe for him. I confess that some small part of me, warmed by the fire and the late hour, still felt the tug of the uncanny. Was it so impossible that there might be, somewhere in the great fog of London, a mind that could lean a little way past the present moment? Holmes, catching the direction of my glance, allowed himself the faintest smile. You would find it a pleasant thought, he murmured, that there are regions of knowledge which even I must approach with my hat in my hand. Take comfort, my dear fellow, that the unknown remains vast enough without our granting it the postal privileges of the General Post Office. It was said gently without sting, and I could not help but return his smile. He lifted the letter, letting it dangle before the firelight. Consider, instead, what must be true if this document is genuine in its accuracy, yet human in its origin. To describe Sir Edwin's movements, his last words, even the disposition of the room, the writer must possess access, physical, social, and temporal. He must reach the victim, or those about him, and he must be able to shape the scene so that events fall, one after another, into the channels he has dug upon this page. He spoke now almost to himself, the words slow, measured, as if he were laying rails across some mental landscape. A foretold crime, Watson, is merely a crime rehearsed in advance. Each prediction is a cue, each detail a stage direction. Whoever penned this has chosen his theater with care. London's postal system, with its multiple daily deliveries, allows him to send his script at precisely the hour required, just as the Alpine Express, with its fixed timetable and enclosed carriages, offers him a moving stage upon which to arrange his actors. "The Alpine Express?" I repeated, feeling the phrase settle in the room like a new piece on the chessboard. Holmes inclined his head. "You observed, did you not, the reference in the postscript to the Basel mail and the 8 o'clock alignment of clocks? Our dramatist is thinking in rails and schedules, not in stars and omens." He let the letter fall lightly upon the mantel where it lay like a gauntlet. "We shall therefore treat this not as a whisper from fate, but as a challenge from a human mind, a mind that has selected the Alpine Express for its next performance. And if a man chooses a train as his theater, Watson, what does that suggest about where we must be when the curtain rises?" Holmes did not answer his own question at once. Instead, he reached again for the letter, the thin sheet whispering in the quiet room as he smoothed it upon his knee. And in that small, deliberate motion, I felt the case begin to take on bones and sinew. "If you can, settle in, get comfortable, and imagine the two of us there, with the fire low and London pressed like pale fog against the window panes. The first line, Watson," he murmured, "if you please." I cleared my throat and read, more slowly than before, for the words now seemed to carry weight. "On the night of the 22nd, as the Alpine Express runs south from London toward the snows, a gentleman answering to the name, or the description, of Mr. Fossum, Charles Petton, will meet his end in the second-class sleeping carriage, compartment B, at precisely 10 minutes past midnight." The fire gave a soft sigh behind us, a coal collapsing into quiet redness, and I heard my own voice, as if from the far end of a corridor. "Note," Holmes said, eyes half closed, "the curious courtesy of name or the description. Our writer anticipates the possibility of an alias, yet is confident of the man. That argues knowledge, not clairvoyance." I read on. "The letter spoke of the Alpine Express as if it were an old acquaintance, leaving London in the afternoon, slipping across the Channel by nightfall, then gliding eastward through France, past fields silvered with frost and little stations where the lamps burned with a domestic warmth, before turning toward the white teeth of the Alps. There was no talk of danger, only of snow on distant ridges, of stars glimpsed from a darkened window, of the soft rhythm of wheels that could, the writer suggested, carry a man toward peaceful sleep, or into eternity with equal indifference. It was, I could not help thinking, a trifle literary for a mere warning. Odd, is it not, I observed, that our prophet lingers over the scenery, yet omits any description of the assailant? Precisely, Holmes replied. We are given a train, a carriage, a compartment, an hour and a victim whose identity is both concealed and revealed. What is withheld is as important as what is granted. Breathe with me as we begin to consider why. He bade me reread the sentence naming the time. 10 minutes past midnight in compartment B. Outside, the city sounds had dwindled to a low murmur, like surf heard through walls, and his voice took on that lecturing softness I had heard in many a long winter evening. You recall, Watson, how the Victorian postal system can deliver a letter across London within a few hours. Combine that with railway timetables, and one may send a message that appears prophetic, yet is only punctual. You think, then, that the writer has merely consulted Bradshaw? Bradshaw, he said, and perhaps the printed schedule of the Alpine Express itself. A man who knows that the train will be in open country at midnight, that the second-class carriages will be sparsely occupied, and that the postal collections will carry his letter to Baker Street this evening, may arrange his affairs so that we receive this charming composition just in time to feel helpless. He smiled, very slightly. Precision, my dear fellow, can manufacture the illusion of fate. For a moment he fell into that particular silence whose texture I had come to recognize, like the pause before a conductor's baton falls. Then, quite suddenly, he rose. However, he said, and the word cut cleanly through the room's drowsy warmth, our correspondent has miscalculated in one respect. He assumes that we shall observe, not participate. If a crime is scheduled, then it has a timetable, and if it has a timetable, it may be met. His gaze moved from the clock to the fogged window and back again. We must be upon that train, Watson, on the Alpine Express, in second class, compartment B, when the hands reach 10 minutes past midnight. Let us see what becomes of prophecy when reason travels in the same carriage. Holmes's declaration seemed to settle upon the room like an additional layer of lamplight, not brighter but clearer, outlining the next hours with the quiet firmness of ink upon a timetable. For a moment we simply sat, the two of us and the letter between us, while the fire whispered at the grate and the fog pressed its soft, patient face against the window panes of Baker Street. Then, I said at last, hearing the steadiness of my own voice with a faint surprise, we had best not keep prophecy waiting. Holmes's only reply was a small inclination of the head as he reached for Bradshaw's Railway Guide, that familiar dog-eared volume whose thin pages had accompanied so many of our journeys. His fingertip moved down the columns with the same unhurried precision I had seen him employ upon a chemical table, pausing here, sliding there, while the clock on the mantel ticked its approval, the 10:45 to the continent. A connection at the coast, a night crossing, and then the line that would carry us toward the Alpine Express. It was all there in black and white, as soothing in its predictability as the rhythm of a sleeping man's breath. "Plenty of time," he murmured, "even for you to fold your shirts, Watson." There was in that gentle dig the signal that the decision was made. I rose and moved to my modest valise, the same worn leather that had seen Afghanistan dust and Swiss snow, and began the small familiar rites of departure. A shirt folded with more care than skill. Another, and then a third, my shaving things. A woolen vest whose virtues I had come to appreciate more with every London winter. These were not the accoutrements of romance, but there was a quiet comfort in their very ordinariness, as if each neatly placed garment were a reassurance that, whatever awaited us, we would meet it as we always had, together, and properly equipped. Behind me, I heard the delicate click of metal as Holmes opened the morocco case that held his instruments, the lens, the tape, the tiny bottles and glass tubes that had so often transformed conjecture into certainty. He did not hurry. He never did when there was true urgency. Instead, he checked each item with the same calm attention he had given the railway tables, as though he meant to remind both of us that logic, too, had its luggage. "Doctor," came Mrs. Hudson's voice from the door, soft yet resolute, "if you're going out on a night like this, you'll not go without something over that thin neck of yours." Before I could protest that my neck was of perfectly ordinary robustness, she had crossed the room with that bustling, motherly efficiency which no mystery had ever succeeded in disturbing, and laid an extra scarf and a pair of thick gloves upon the back of my chair. There was, I reflected, no stationer in London whose watermark could match the unmistakable imprint of Mrs. Hudson's care. "You'll have him back by morning, Mr. Holmes," she added, with a glance that took in both of us, the letter and the open valise, or near enough as makes no matter. Holmes gave her one of his rare, genuine smiles. That is, I think, the most precise form of timetable we could desire. He slipped the railway tickets, purchased earlier that afternoon, on some errand he had not troubled to explain, into the inner pocket of his coat, patting them once as a man might reassure himself of a well-loaded revolver. I, for my part, ensured that my notebook and pen were securely in place. There was something almost ceremonial in the way my fingers closed around them, as if by that small act I acknowledged that the case had truly begun. And yet, as I shrugged into my overcoat and felt the first faint chill of the stairwell creep under the door, a momentary reluctance stirred within me. The sitting room, with its familiar clutter, its books and chemical apparatus and worn armchairs, held a warmth that was more than the work of the fire. It was the warmth of habit, of evenings spent in quiet talk or companionable silence, of soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts. To exchange that for the cold streets, the rattling cab, the echoing station, was it entirely wise? When the crime we pursued had not yet occurred? But then my gaze fell once more upon the letter, lying where Holmes had placed it upon the table, and the unease was tempered by curiosity. A message that knew the future, written in a hand so close to his own that even Lestrade might be forgiven for confusion. A crime scheduled as neatly as a train's departure. A promise that at 10 minutes past midnight, something, or someone, would not arrive. Could I truly remain by the fire while such a challenge went unanswered? "Come, Watson," Holmes said quietly, as if he had followed my thoughts step by step. The night will not grow any warmer while we debated. We descended the familiar 17 stairs of 221B with the measured tread of men who have made this journey many times before, past the framed prints, past the landing where so many clients had paused to gather courage, past the faint, deep, comforting aroma of Mrs. Hudson's earlier supper still lingering in the air. Behind us, the fire in our sitting room burned on with steady composure, its light spilling across the worn carpet and the empty chairs, as though keeping its own watch over the quiet space we left behind. The door closed softly at our backs, the latch giving a small, decisive click that seemed, in the winter stillness, almost ceremonial. The city's night air met us with a cool, bracing touch upon the cheek, like the hand of an old acquaintance who has much to tell and little time in which to say it. Somewhere in the fog-veiled distance a cab's wheels rattled over the stones, and I found myself wondering, not for the first time, whether the future that awaited us at the station belonged to the letter's promise or to Holmes's reason. We stepped out into the dim, waiting street, and as the sound of an approaching horse grew clearer through the mist, I had the distinct sensation that something unseen had just consulted its own timetable and found that we were precisely on time. The cab drew up with that particular clatter of harness and soft thud of hooves that belongs to London more than to any single horse, and in another moment we were within, the door closed, the city framed to us now by a single, slightly misted window. As you settle in, get comfortable, you might picture it with me. A small moving room of worn leather and faint horsehair carrying us out into the fog-bound night. The wheels found the damp cobbles at once, and the familiar muffled rhythm began a steady clop and roll that seemed to smooth the edges from thought, so that even my curiosity about the letter's promises became something quieter, more measured. Outside, the gas lamps hung in the fog like pale coins sunk in cloudy water, each one ringed with its own soft halo, blurring at the edges, joining and parting again as we passed. Now and then, where a street widened or a corner turned, a shop window still glowed against the dark, displaying bolts of cloth or a pyramid of oranges, their color muted by the glass and the mist, yet still insisting gently that commerce did not entirely sleep. Watson, in these moments, had learned to let the city slide by as if it were a slow-moving river, and tonight was no exception. He watched the silhouettes of passers-by, the occasional umbrella held low against the fine drizzle, the dim suggestion of a hansome's outline crossing our path, and he found himself counting not the streets, but the journeys. How many nights had he sat opposite Holmes in just such a cab, the same dull gleam of the carriage lamp on the detective's sharp profile, the same mixture of routine and quiet anticipation. Each case began like this, with wheels on wet stone, with fog at the window, with the sense that London itself was turning a page. The air within the cab was close, holding the lingering scent of leather, damp wool, and the faint tang of coal smoke that filtered in whenever the cab slowed and the driver called out to another in passing. Their brief exchange floating down to us in half-heard phrases. From somewhere ahead came the distant whistle of a train, thin and far off, as if the station were already calling to us. Each time the cab checked its pace, a thread of cold air slipped under the door, touched our ankles, and retreated again, like a cautious visitor to a warm room. Opposite me, Holmes sat with his eyes closed, his long fingers steepled, the posture that to the uninitiated suggested repose, but which I had come to recognize as the outer sign of his most concentrated activity. He was, I knew, running through the problem as one might run a thumb along the edge of a knife, testing its line from every angle. The postmark's timing in a city whose postal deliveries could dance with railway timetables to a minute. The handwriting, so nearly his own that it seemed to mock his individuality. The logistics by which a letter could arrive at Baker Street at precisely the moment our evening had grown quiet enough to receive it. Was it prophecy, or some intricate exploitation of ink, paper, and schedule? And if the future could be so neatly folded into an envelope, whose hand had done the folding? The journey lengthened and softened, as such rides do when the pattern of streets becomes familiar and the mind drifts between observation and reflection. These were, I often thought, the true thresholds of our adventures, the in-between spaces where nothing quite happened and yet everything was being prepared. They were soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, told by the city itself in the language of lamp and cobblestone, of distant whistles and receding hoofbeats. At last the cab swung into the broader, brighter approach to the station, and the fog lifted somewhat, thinned by the restless movement of air. The great facade loomed up, its windows glowing with a steadier light, and beyond, under the high iron arches, we could see the slow exhalations of steam drifting and curling, silver against the sooty ribs of the roof. Porters moved there like purposeful shadows, pushing barrows, hoisting luggage with practiced ease, their voices low, absorbed by the vast enclosed space, until they became part of its background murmur. We stepped down, paying our man, and passed under the great clock that presided over it all, with the calm indifference of a judge who has heard every possible plea. Around us, late travelers moved with subdued haste, coats buttoned high, breath showing faintly in the cooler air, the glow from the lamps casting a gentle warmth over iron, stone, and steam. Somewhere a guard's whistle sounded, not urgent but inevitable. and I felt, as I so often had, that we were crossing from one order of time into another, from the comfortable irregularities of Baker Street to the strict, measured world of timetables and departures. "Note, Watson," Holmes murmured at my side, his eyes already alive and open now, sweeping the concourse with quiet hunger. "How a place devoted to schedules lends itself to those who would pretend to command the future." His tone held that light, dry edge that told me his mind had seized upon some fresh connection. I found myself wondering, as we walked toward the platforms, whether the letter's unseen author was already here among these soft-footed figures, watching us arrive exactly when they had planned, and whether the next signal, whistle, bell, or the simple fall of a guard's hand would bring us closer to their carefully written tomorrow or to Holmes's unwritten reply. For now, though, we simply moved forward beneath the iron arches, letting the station's mingled scents of coal, steam, and damp stone wrap around us, another kind of fog, and I invite you to breathe with me as we begin this next stage, letting the rhythm of trains and footsteps carry you toward peaceful sleep, even as the mystery ahead grows quietly more precise. The station opened around us like a great covered valley of stone and iron, a man-made ravine in which sound moved strangely, so that a single footstep might seem to follow you, and a quiet word spoken at one end drifted, thinned, and stretched to the other. Under the high, soot-darkened roof, lamps cast soft pools of golden light that left the upper girders in a kind of suspended dusk, and in that half-lit air the breath of the locomotives rose and fell, a slow, patient exhalation of steam that sounded almost like sleep. Settle in, get comfortable, and picture that interior as if you were walking there beside them. The cool flagstones holding the memory of the day's damp, the echo of boots and wheels and the faint clatter of porters' trolleys, the low, continuous murmur of travelers' voices blending with the more distant cry of a newsboy and the occasional sharper note of a guard's whistle. The air carried the mingled scent of coal smoke, wet wool and ink, that particular railway perfume that spoke of letters dispatched, journeys begun, and timetables obeyed. Holmes and Watson moved through this room of ordered bustle with the ease of long practice, two familiar figures absorbed for the moment into the anonymous stream. Tickets were produced and inspected with a brief, almost ceremonial pause, the inspector's punch snapping down in a tiny, decisive rhythm that matched the steady ticking of the great station clock overhead. Luggage passed from Watson's gloved hand to that of a porter, the doctor watching with the mild anxiety of a man who has once lost a medical bag and never quite forgotten the lesson. They paused, as they always did, before the wall-mounted timetable, that vast grid of destinations and hours, its neat black letters and precise columns offering the comforting illusion that the world could be arranged, if not understood, by the simple alignment of numbers. Here was London yielding itself to rule and measure, trains to the coast, to the Midlands, to the north, connections that would, with only a little imagination, carry you to Paris, to Basel, and on into the snow-shadowed heart of Europe. Holmes's gaze flicked over the entries with a practiced swiftness, but Watson, as ever, felt the quiet charm of it, the way the future seemed to sit there, pinned to the board like a specimen butterfly. It was much the same at the post, he reflected, recalling how the mysterious letter had reached Baker Street with such unnerving punctuality. In this age of multiple daily deliveries, of messengers hurrying beneath the London fog with canvas bags and careful hands, a man might almost believe in prophecy when a note arrived at precisely the right hour. Yet Holmes had already pointed out, in his soft, lecturing way, that such miracles were merely the result of human ingenuity applied to fixed schedules. A clever mind could exploit the interval between a morning collection and an afternoon delivery as neatly as another man might use a locked door. "Consider, Watson," he had said, "how a railway timetable and a postal schedule together form a kind of lattice on which any number of deceptions may be trained to grow." And now, standing before the great board, Watson saw what he meant more clearly than ever. Each line of print might be an alibi, each announced arrival a possible misdirection, each connection a narrow window in which a crime could be prepared, performed, and then apparently foretold. Still, for all Holmes's cool reflections, there was a softer current running beneath Watson's thoughts, a quiet thrill that had nothing to do with forged handwriting or manipulated postmarks. The Alpine Express. The very phrase seemed to contain within it a change of air, a lifting of the horizon. London's familiar fog would be left behind, its yellow windows and cramped rooms exchanged for white slopes and dark firs, for tunnels through the mountains and long Javel. Lamplit corridors where the stories of strangers unfolded in the privacy of enclosed compartments. He imagined snow striking the window in small, patient taps, while the carriage rocked gently. Imagined the warmth of upholstered seats, the subdued clink of glass and china in the dining car, the soft breathing of sleeping travelers behind polished doors. In such a moving room, cut off from the ordinary world by darkness and distance, secrets would feel at home, and the letter that claimed to know the future might find itself among companions of a similar temperament. Around them, the station's rhythm continued. A porter's call, the sigh of a departing engine, the low rumble of wheels drawing up to a platform. Somewhere a clock chimed the quarter hour, its notes falling through the iron rafters like drops of clear water into a deep well. Holmes consulted his watch with a brief nod, as though confirming that the world for the moment still kept time according to his expectations. "Come, Watson," he said quietly, and there was, beneath the composure, the faintest undertone of anticipation, as if even he were not entirely immune to the romance of a train that would carry them out of their well-known streets and into a landscape drawn in white and shadow. They turned from the timetable and walked toward their platform, their footsteps joining the station's broad chorus. The waiting carriages of the Alpine Express stood in a long, dignified line, their windows glowing with lamplight that spilled in soft rectangles onto the platform, turning the drifting steam into sheets of pale gold. Names and numbers gleamed on polished brass, and in the nearer compartments Watson could see the silhouettes of early passengers arranging rugs and bags, turning small, private spaces into temporary homes. A guard's voice rose, clear and measured, announcing the train and its destination, the words "Alpine Express," carrying out beneath the roof and away into the cool night, as though already seeking the snow beyond the city. For a moment, as they stepped forward, ticket in hand, it seemed to Watson that the future itself waited just beyond the nearest door, as neatly scheduled and as quietly mysterious as any departure on the board behind them. Watson would later say that there was a moment, just before his boot left the platform, when London seemed to draw a soft breath and hold it, as though the city itself were watching to see whether they would step into the future that waited behind that polished door. The Alpine Express stood at its berth, like some patient, gleaming creature of wood and metal, its dark carriages joined in a quiet procession, brass fittings polished to a mellow glow that caught the station lamps and broke them into small book, steady fires along its length, Windows, framed in varnished timber, shone with a soft interior light, each one a little room of warmth against the winter gloom. And from beneath the great iron wheels a plume of steam curled upward in slow, ghostly ribbons, unfurling along the roof as if the train flew its own white banner into the fog-heavy night. Breathe with me as we begin, and if you like, settle in, get comfortable, because the world we are about to enter is a moving one, yet curiously enclosed, a place where corridors replace streets and where strangers share walls instead of pavements. Holmes went first, his long stride unhurried, and Watson followed, feeling the firm chill of the carriage step through the leather of his boot, that small, decisive rise from stone to steel, from the echoing width of the platform to the narrower, more yielding space of the train. There was a brief sway as he passed through the doorway, that almost imperceptible give and answer of suspension and frame, and with it came a change in the very quality of sound, for the station's scattered calls and clatter fell away behind him, thinned by glass and paneling, until they became only a muted murmur, like a distant sea heard through the walls of a quiet room. Inside, the corridor welcomed them with polished wood and dim, considerate lamps, their light falling in soft pools along the carpet runner, and as the conductor moved ahead with their tickets, Watson's gaze lingered on the small brass numerals and frosted panes that marked each compartment, those self-contained worlds in miniature. Their own compartment, when the door slid back, revealed wood-paneled walls whose varnish had known years of hands and sunlight, upholstered seats in a rich, slightly worn fabric that suggested both comfort and long service, luggage racks of curved brass above, and small fold-down tables waiting, like discreet servants, to receive books, maps, and the inevitable teapot. Hooks for coats and hats stood ready by the door, a detail Watson always found faintly reassuring, as though the train acknowledged that one might wish to hang up not only one's great coat, but a measure of one's cares as well, at least for the length of the journey. It occurred to him, as he shrugged out of his own coat and stowed their bags, that this narrow space would be their moving home for days, a corridor of routines and quiet rituals, of morning coffee brought on a tray, of shared meals in the dining car with its clink of china and snow-blurred windows, of chance encounters in the passageway where a single remark about the timetable or the weather might, in Holmes's hands, become a clue. Outside, layers of glass and velvet curtain would hold back the cold, sealing in a pocket of traveling warmth while the winter countryside slid past unseen in the darkness, and within that cocoon of wood and brass their investigation into a letter that claimed to know the future would unfold according to its own, more intricate schedule. An enclosed system, Watson, Holmes murmured, settling opposite him, long fingers steepled, gray eyes already distant, with fixed points, regular intervals, and a finite cast of characters. Ideal conditions, one might say, for testing whether fate is merely well-arranged human ingenuity. Watson opened his notebook, the paper catching the light from the shaded lamp, and felt the familiar quiet thrill that came whenever a case shifted from possibility to pursuit, from speculation to the first firm lines of inquiry. The door slid shut with a soft click, sealing them into their compartment. A moment later, the first gentle jolt of departure ran through the carriage like a slow, awakening heartbeat, and as the platform began to drift away beyond the window, Holmes turned his head sharply, his gaze fixing on a single, unexpected figure striding past their glass. Someone Watson had not seen since the day the prophetic letter first reached Baker Street. For a heartbeat, Watson's mind caught on that passing figure, on the echo of the letter's first arrival in their quiet Baker Street room, and then the train gathered itself beneath them and carried the moment away, folding it into motion and distance. The platform slipped like a slow-moving stage set beyond the window, faces smearing into streaks of color, lamps drawing long, soft lines of gold that broke, reformed, and finally gave themselves up to the waiting dark. The sensation of departure was, as it so often is, both gentle and undeniable, a low, persuasive tug that ran through the floorboards, a slight leaning of the body that reminded one that the earth had not moved, but they had. There came the first clear clatter of wheels over the points, that distinctive, hollow punctuation which marked their passage from one set of rails to another, and with each successive click and sway the train seemed to find its rhythm. As if a musician testing notes had at last settled on a melody it knew by heart. The station lights, once a close ring of watchful eyes, began to slide away, slower than seemed quite possible, then more quickly, then all at once, until they were no more than a few pale embers winking behind them. Inside the compartment, there was a small, companionable shiver as the lamp above their heads answered the change of speed with a lazy swing, casting its circle of warmth first toward Holmes, then toward Watson, then toward the door, like a quiet host uncertain which guest to favor. Coats on their hooks swayed in sympathetic agreement, the heavy fabric moving with a decorous reluctance, and the glass in the window frame gave a soft, intermittent rattle, no louder than a teaspoon laid gently in a saucer. The seat cushions transmitted a faint, continuous vibration, not enough to disturb, merely enough to remind one that this little room was not fixed to any one place, but was instead being carried, almost tenderly, through the winter night. Watson turned his attention to the window, for it was his habit on such journeys to let the world unspool beside him until his thoughts grew as slow and even as the passing scenery. London did not vanish at once. It rarely granted that kind of theatrical exit. Instead, the dense streets thinned by degrees, the rows of brick houses becoming shorter, then more irregular, until narrow gaps appeared between them where small gardens, sheds, and the occasional solitary tree stood in quiet surprise at finding themselves so near the rails. Under the winter sky, everything was rendered in shades of gray and silver, as though some thoughtful hand had lowered a gauze over the city to spare tired eyes. Here and there, upper windows burned with a pale domestic fire, squares of light that hinted at late suppers, at letters being written, at someone else's soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts while the lower floors already lay in sleep. A solitary cab crossed a bridge below, its lantern a moving star in the fog that clung about the river. A goods yard slipped past, its stacks of crates and idle wagons transformed into a child's forgotten toys by the distance and the hour. Then even these signs of concentrated life fell away, replaced by broader roads, quieter terraces, and finally by the first open fields, their hedgerows drawn in ink against the dim sheen of frost-silvered grass. The sounds of travel arranged themselves into a pattern that was at once repetitive and curiously soothing. The steady beat of the wheels on the rails became a kind of mechanical heartbeat, regular and unhurried, its fourfold cadence saying, again and again, that time would pass whether they fretted over it or not. From somewhere ahead came, at intervals, the distant, muffled whistle of the engine, softened by distance into something almost like a human sigh, as if the great machine were exhaling the day and settling into its own long night's work. Occasionally the carriage timbers gave a quiet creak of protest, quickly soothed by the next smooth stretch of track, and the window glass answered with that same light rattle, a domestic sound that would not have been out of place in a modest sitting room. If you settle in, get comfortable, you might find, as Watson did, that such sounds begin to weave themselves into a natural lullaby, one that can carry you toward peaceful sleep without asking anything more of you than that you listen. He watched as the last stubborn outposts of the suburbs, an inn with a swinging sign, a row of allotments marked by dark, tidy rectangles of earth, a lonely gas lamp guarding an empty crossroads, fell behind, and then the countryside opened fully, broad and unembarrassed under the low, clouded sky. Fields punctuated by bare trees whose branches reached up like ink strokes against the paler gray, rolled past in long, unhurried sweeps. Now and then a farmhouse appeared. Its windows, 2 or 3 warm coins of light dropped into the surrounding darkness, before it too was gone. Within the compartment, the sense of being in a gently rocking cocoon deepened. The air held the faint, clean smell of cold iron from the corridor, mingled with the subtler notes of woolen coats, polished leather, and the lingering memory of London's fog that had clung to them when they boarded. Holmes, opposite, had sunk a little deeper into his corner, his long legs easily folded, his profile turned 3/4 toward the window, yet clearly not given over to the view. With an almost absent-minded precision, he drew out his pipe, filled it from the familiar worn pouch, and struck a match. The brief flare painted his features in miniature theater, the sharp planes of cheek and brow, the thoughtful set of his mouth, the pale eyes momentarily catching the light before it sank. Then the match went out, and the glow of the pipe bowl took over, a small, steady ember that brightened and dimmed in time with his breathing. Each inhalation brought a soft, fragrant cloud that curled upward, found the warmer air near the lamp, and spread itself in a thin, even veil across the ceiling, like a low-lying indoor fog. Holmes had taken the letter from his pocket almost before the train had quite cleared the last of the station lamps. Now it lay unfolded upon his knee, the paper catching the lamplight in a way that revealed to Watson's observant eye the faint watermark he had seen Holmes examine so intently earlier that afternoon. One long, slender finger traced not the written words themselves, but the spaces between them, as though he were following an invisible map that only he could read. From time to time his gaze lifted, not to Watson, but to some point just beyond the compartment wall, as if the rails beneath them were not merely carrying them through England, but sliding them along the carefully calculated timetable of whoever had composed that prophetic note. "Remarkable, is it not?" Holmes murmured at last, his voice quiet enough that it scarcely disturbed the soft chorus of wheel and wind. "How easily men will attribute to fate what can be achieved with a railway guide, a knowledge of the postal schedules, and a sufficient degree of patience?" The question did not, strictly speaking, require an answer, and Watson, lulled by the motion and the sound, merely inclined his head, feeling that Holmes was speaking as much to the moving night as to him. Yet somewhere beneath the calm of the journey, beneath the comfort of the gently rocking room and the distant promise of sleep, the image of that unexpected figure on the platform stirred again, refusing to be entirely left behind with the departing lights of London. Breathe with me as we begin to leave the familiar streets in our wake, for the rails ahead will not only test Holmes's logic against the letter's claim to know the future, but will, before the night is over, bring that quiet question of fate and design to a far more personal doorstep than Watson yet suspects. So we settle in, get comfortable, and allow the geography to change around us in a way that is almost more idea than experience, a quiet rearranging of names on a map while the rhythm of wheels and the soft sway of the carriage remain the same. The decision, once taken, unfolds in its own calm sequence. Cabs and porters, platforms and tickets, each step following the last with the inevitability of a well-ordered sentence. Holmes, who could on occasion treat travel as an irksome necessity, was on this evening almost content, for the journey from London to the continent offered him that particular kind of order he secretly prized. A chain of connections whose links were forged in ink and punctuality. There was the late train down to the coast, its lamps casting a modest glow on muffled figures and damp scarves. Then the brief transition through the Channel port, where the air smelled faintly of salt and coal smoke, and then the crossing itself, mentioned here only as a continued motion, a gentle rocking in the dark, like turning over in one's sleep and finding the pillow already shaped to one's head. Watson, watching Holmes consult the small, much-thumbed European timetable that lived in his overcoat pocket, reflected that the international railways were in their own way a web as intricate as any conspiracy they had ever chased. Timetables knitted countries together, he thought, so that a man might dine in London, wake in Paris, and take his coffee beneath Alpine peaks, all because some unseen clerk had aligned columns of figures with almost mathematical devotion. It appealed to Holmes, naturally. He traced with a fingertip the thin printed line that showed their intended path, as if following a clue across borders. At the French station where they changed trains, the differences presented themselves not as shocks, but as small, almost courteous variations. The signs above the platforms bore unfamiliar words, yet the arrows and numbers spoke the same universal language of direction. The porters wore caps of a slightly different cut, but they still stooped with identical resignation to hoist valises. Travelers consulted watches, adjusted rugs, peered up at the station clock with that same mild anxiety that knows no nationality. Through the window of their compartment, Watson saw a woman tapping a folded timetable against her gloved hand, the gesture so like that of any London commuter that he almost smiled. Later, when the long night portion of their journey had properly begun, the world beyond the window withdrew into darkness, and the compartment settled into a cocoon of dim lamplight and low, companionable silence. Here were the soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, the rustle of the newspaper Holmes had brought from Charing Cross, the creak of leather as Watson shifted on the narrow seat, the faint clink of glass from some distant dining car where a steward cleared away the last of the evening's cups. One might, Watson mused, close one's eyes in one country and open them in another without ever having left this small moving room. There was something almost philosophical in that sensation, as if the earth itself were sliding past while the traveler remained constant, a fixed point carried along by schedules and steel. Holmes, who affected indifference to such reflections, nevertheless checked their progress now and then with a small, satisfied nod, murmuring the names of junctions under his breath, as one might recite a familiar refrain. "We shall be on the Alpine route by dawn," he observed, and Watson, half drowsing, pictured snow and high passes waiting somewhere ahead like a half-remembered story. As the train turned gradually toward the east and the hours deepened, the air that slipped in at the imperfect seals of the window grew cooler, then distinctly cold, so that their breath made the faintest suggestion of fog in the lamplight. Once or twice, Watson, roused by some subtle change in the motion, lifted the blind a few inches and saw only his own reflection, and a scatter of tiny white flecks kissing the glass before vanishing into the night. The mountains were rising around them now, invisible for the moment, but undeniably present, like a thought forming at the edge of consciousness, waiting for morning to bring it fully into view and carry you toward peaceful sleep with its pale, snow-lit certainty. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let your attention drift with the rhythm of the wheels. because this is where the world outside the carriage begins to change, and with it, the texture of our mystery. Breathe with me as we begin this quiet ascent into the realm of snow and shadowed peaks. When Watson woke, it was to a quality of light he associated less with London mornings than with childhood holidays by the sea. Pale, diffused, and curiously clean, as though the air itself had been washed in cold water and laid out to dry. The fog of the lowlands had fallen away in the night, and when he pushed himself up against the padded corner of the compartment and turned to the window, the mountains were at last revealed, not as a vague presence beyond the glass, but as a procession of distant summits, their shoulders dusted with fresh snow that caught the winter sun in soft, glittering facets. Below those white heights, dark fir forests gathered in patient ranks, their branches bearing thin lines of frost, and here and there, in sheltered folds of the valley, small villages clustered around church spires and modest station houses, each one sending up a faint plume of smoke that hung in the still air like a question that had not yet decided whether to rise or remain. The train slid past them with unhurried dignity, offering Watson a series of framed scenes, each one lingering just long enough to be fixed in memory before yielding to the next, like pages turned by an invisible hand. Inside the carriage, the contrast was almost theatrical. The glass of the window was rimmed at the edges, delicate fern-like patterns feathering outward from the metal frame, and when the corridor door opened to admit a porter, a brief breath of air stole in, cool and pure, misting Watson's exhalation for a moment before the steady warmth from the radiators reclaimed the room. His boots rested against a foot warmer that radiated a quiet, dependable heat, and his woolen scarf, loosened now, lay soft across his knees, holding the faint scent of coal fire and the ghost of last night's London fog. On an impulse, he reached out and let his gloved hand rest against the window pane. Even through the leather he felt the chill, a clean, almost invigorating cold that spoke of high air and untroubled snowfields. At the next brief halt, when the door opened again, and a conductor's voice called the name of a wayside halt, there came with it a thread of scent, snow, pine, and distant wood smoke, so gentle he might almost have imagined it, had it not matched precisely the landscape unspooling beyond the glass. The journey settled into a hypnotic repetition, trees rising in solemn files, then the soft darkness of a tunnel, the world outside vanishing so completely that the compartment became its own small floating room of lamplight and upholstery. Then, with a subtle lurch, daylight again, a viaduct flung across a ravine where a river flashed white between rocks before disappearing under the train. Over and over this pattern repeated, until even Watson's orderly medical mind found itself lulled, his thoughts moving more slowly, receptive now, as if the motion of the carriages were a kind of gentle metronome, designed for soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts. From time to time he rose and stepped into the corridor, feeling the slight sway of the train under his feet, and looked along the length of the coaches. At one station he noticed the Countess von Albrecht on the platform, her fur collar drawn up, her eyes scanning the carriages with a nervousness that seemed at odds with the peaceful scene of snow and slate roofs. A little farther down, Signor Castellani stood in easy conversation with a porter, gesturing toward the line of peaks as though they were old acquaintances whose names he could supply at will. Behind a frosted window of the next carriage, a veiled figure, Madame Moreau, if Watson's quick glance did not deceive him, sat very still, her posture too composed for true relaxation, while, in the reflection of the glass, he thought he caught the outline of Miss Albright's profile, keen eyes lowered to a book she did not appear to be reading. Other faces appeared and vanished at each stop. A watchmaker's precise gaze, a maid's hurried step, a stranger's fleeting smile. Somewhere among these quiet travelers, Watson reminded himself, walked both the intended victim of the letter that knew the future and the unseen hand that had penned it, their identities as yet indistinct, like figures glimpsed through falling snow. Holmes, for his part, seemed content to let the landscape pass in silence, his long fingers steepled, his gaze half on the window, half turned inward. Yet Watson knew that behind that apparent repose, every detail, the timing of the halts, the arrangement of the compartments, the very length of each tunnel, was being noted and stored. Outside, the peaks drew closer, their snowfields bright and unwavering. Inside, the carriage held its pool of warmth and quiet, rocking them gently onward, carrying us all, listener and traveler alike, toward that narrowing of the line where scenery would give way to shadowed stone, and the next turn of the mystery, ready to carry you toward peaceful sleep, even as the danger still unseen matched the train mile for mile. So settle in, get comfortable, and picture the train not merely as a line of carriages on steel rails, but as a narrow little village in motion, its rooms arranged in single file, its inhabitants obliged to pass and repass one another in soft, inevitable encounter. Watson, rising from his seat, stepped into the corridor, that slim artery of patterned carpet and polished wood where the whole life of the Alpine Express seemed to flow. The runner yielded quietly underfoot, and the windows on his left gave back his reflection in faint, wavering panes, so that he appeared to walk side by side with a ghostly double, while to his right the compartment doors, with their brass handles and frosted glass, offered only hints of the private worlds within. From time to time the train leaned into a curve, and the floor described a gentle, sideways persuasion, enough to send a tremor along the hanging straps and a soft clink from distant glassware, as if the entire conveyance sighed and resettled itself upon the rails. He moved slowly, noting how each door had already acquired a character. Here the slight smear where a gloved hand habitually rested, there the faintest trace of scent, tobacco, lavender, the more practical soap of a commercial traveler, each a small history written upon brass and wood. It pleased the doctor in him to observe such things, to imagine temperaments from posture and tread, while the writer in him, never entirely off-duty, arranged these strangers into types: the anxious aristocrat, the cheerful man of trade, the self-contained artisan, the watchful governess, each framed by a window, each lit by the moving winter light. Holmes, when they met at the junction of two carriages, appeared merely to be stretching his legs, his expression one of distant preoccupation. Yet Watson, who had learned over long years to recognize the particular quality of that quiet process, understood that every passing face, every lowered voice, every exchanged nod was being stored away, classified, and cross-referenced behind those gray eyes for use at some future necessary moment. Where Watson saw potential characters, Holmes saw potential evidence. The dining car formed, as evening drew on, the warm central square of this traveling village. Passing through the door was like stepping from the chill fog beyond the window into a well-kept room in some discreet hotel. White tablecloths spread with a care that spoke of ritual, small shaded lamps casting islands of amber light, and the rhythmic clink of china and cutlery providing a kind of domestic music under which a quiet murmur of conversation in several languages rose and fell. There was the comforting aroma of soup, clear broth for some, thicker and more generous for others, of fresh bread with its faint yeasty sweetness, and of tea that sent up small, curling banners of steam like signals of truce to the day's fatigue. Here the rituals of train life asserted themselves with a gentle firmness. The same steward moved along the aisle at fixed hours, menus held like a sheaf of formal invitations, his face acquiring that peculiar familiarity that belongs neither to friend nor stranger. Passengers took their accustomed places as though pews had been assigned. The Countess and her maid beneath one lamp, Signor Castellani with his easy smile and precise questions about timetables at another, Herr Kaufmann folding his napkin with watchmaker's care, Miss Albright observing everything with the calm of one used to classrooms and small dramas. They nodded. They exchanged a word or two, they resumed their patterns, night after night, until habit began to feel like inevitability. Watson, seated opposite Holmes, let his gaze travel from table to table, cataloging the tiny domestic details that he knew his friend prized, a smear of ink on a cuff where no writing had been done that day, a letter folded and refolded until its creases were soft, a timetable consulted a shade too often for mere curiosity. He thought of the mysterious letter that had drawn them from Baker Street, with its uncanny knowledge of events yet to unfold, and he could not help wondering which of these quiet diners believed, in their secret hearts, in fate. Holmes, apparently absorbed in his soup, allowed his eyes to drift once, briefly, to the door at the far end of the car, the door that led back toward the sleeping compartments, toward the narrow corridor and its brass-handled secrets, toward the compartment where, before the journey's end, a predicted crime would either be fulfilled or confounded. The Alpine Express had become, in that moment, a self-contained world of wood, brass, and fabric, sliding through snow and rock. And as the lamp swayed gently with the motion, it seemed to Watson that all the necessary pieces of a mystery were now quietly in place, waiting only for the instant when some unseen hand would choose to move the first one. Breathe with me as we begin to listen for that move, for it was closer than any of them, lulled by warmth and routine, yet suspected. The train slid on, a soft, steady motion beneath their feet, and as the first lull of the journey settled over the carriage, Watson found his gaze wandering from the window's blurred darkness to the small society that chance had gathered around them. It was, he reflected, one of the quiet pleasures of travel. This temporary village of strangers, their lives brushing for a night and then parting forever, like sparks drifting apart from the same fire. Opposite them, in a corner seat that seemed almost to have arranged itself around her, an older lady had established a small domestic kingdom, a square jewel case, polished but not ostentatious, rested within easy reach of her gloved hand, while from an open reticule peeped the soft tangle of pale knitting wool and the shining tips of steel needles. She thanked the attendant for her tea with a warmth that made him smile, yet when a porter passed too close, her fingers tightened ever so slightly upon the case, as though habit had taught them to stand sentry even while the mind drifted toward sleep. Watson, who had seen many nervous travelers, wondered idly whether it was the jewels she guarded or some memory bound up with them. A few seats along, scattering newspapers like fallen leaves around his boots, sat a broad-shouldered gentleman with a waistcoat that strained amiably at its buttons. He laughed often, and rather more loudly than the room required, at items in the evening edition, tapping headlines about foreign markets and inheritance disputes with a well-fed forefinger, as if the print itself were an old acquaintance. He addressed the staff with hearty familiarity, misremembering names but overcompensating with tips, and when the train gave a sudden, deeper sway, he clapped a hand upon his leather dispatch case, with the absent-minded care of a man who has never yet mislaid money, but very much intends to keep that record. Between these two, at a small table where the lamp's circle of light seemed to isolate him from the rest, a young man in a frayed coat sat bolt upright, a battered valise pressed close against his leg. He drank his coffee too quickly, glanced too often toward the door, and started whenever the carriage entered a short tunnel and the window turned from dim reflection to blank darkness. Once, when his fingers slipped from the handle of the valise, Watson glimpsed not the expected shirt sleeves and books, but the corner of a metal cash box and an envelope on thick, expensive paper, its flap already creased from repeated opening. "Observe his thumb," Holmes murmured, so quietly that only Watson could hear. "The ink at the edge, not a clerk, and not quite a gentleman." He said no more, and Watson, who had learned to recognize that particular quality of silence, felt curiosity prick at him like a draught under a door. Near the far window, where the glass showed only their own soft reflections and the suggestion of snow beyond, a thin, scholarly figure was engaged in a losing battle with a sheaf of papers that kept sliding toward the aisle. His fingers were stained with ink, not in the smudged patches of a careless writer, but in those delicate crescents that speak of pens refilled in haste and margins annotated in crowded trains and colder rooms. On the topmost page, Watson caught a glimpse of neat columns, postal districts, railway times, and, oddly enough, a list of London stationers whose names stirred some faint echo of Holmes's earlier lectures on watermarks and paper. The man's spectacles rode low upon his nose, and when the attendant offered him supper, he declined with a distracted smile, as if nourishment for the body were a matter of secondary importance compared with the alignment of his carefully inked figures. Closer to Holmes and Watson, occupying a pair of facing seats that seemed to define their own small island of shared silence, sat a well-dressed couple of perhaps 35. The lady's gown was perfectly chosen for travel, her gloves immaculate, her hat pinned with the precision of a woman accustomed to being observed. Yet she turned the pages of her novel without once appearing to read them, her eyes drifting instead to the window, where the faint reflection of her husband's profile hovered beside her own. He, for his part, consulted a slim leather notebook at intervals, closing it whenever she glanced his way and asking after her comfort with a politeness that was just a shade too carefully measured, like a letter revised once too often before posting. Holmes's gaze passed over them all with that unfocused attention that Watson had come to recognize as its most concentrated form. "A curious little cross-section, is it not?" he remarked at last. "Between London and our destination, one might chart the entire range of human expectation. Money hoped for, money feared lost, reputations to be preserved, and futures some would give much to control. Seeing only an elderly lady with her knitting, a jovial man with his newspapers, a nervous youth with a shabby bag, a scholar with his timetables, and a couple whose marriage he thought would probably endure on courtesy, if not on warmth. What more could there be? Holmes, however, had already returned his attention to the letter that lay folded in his pocket, the letter that had known, with unnerving precision, the hour of this train's departure and the presence of a jewel case, a cash box, and a packet of closely written papers in the same carriage. Somewhere among these soft-spoken travelers, he knew, were those for whom the future was not a thing to be awaited, but a design to be sketched, amended, and, if necessary, enforced. For the moment, though, the carriage held only the low murmur of conversation, the clink of china, and the rhythmic whisper of wheels. Settle in, get comfortable, for these are soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, and the pattern was not yet clear enough to name. Yet as the lamp swayed gently and the snow pressed its white fog against the window, Watson had the odd sensation that the room itself was listening, as if the very air were waiting for the first small word or gesture that would reveal which of these quiet figures intended to let the future arrive, and which had already taken steps to write it in their own hand. Here, at least, the mystery still wore an ordinary face, and if you breathe with me as we begin to look more closely, you may find, as Holmes did, that the most dangerous intentions often travel under the most respectable luggage labels. So let us settle in, get comfortable, and follow Holmes a little further down the softly rocking corridor of the Alpine Express, where the future, if we believed the letter, had already chosen its next acquaintance. The dining car held that particular warmth that only shaded lamps, white linen, and the quiet clink of china can create, a kind of traveling sitting room in which strangers agreed, for an hour, to behave as if they had known one another for years. Beyond the window, the snow was a pale blur, the world outside reduced to a moving fog of whiteness, while within silver gleamed, steam curled gently from teapots, and the low murmur of conversation rose and fell like a contented breath. Holmes, with that air of casual inevitability that Watson had long since ceased to mistake for chance, drifted toward an unoccupied table laid for three, opposite which sat a solitary gentleman finishing a light supper. He was, as Watson later recorded, somewhere in his middle years, his hair already silvered at the temples in a way that suited the thoughtful, rather kindly lines of his face, and his clothes bore the unobtrusive quality of one accustomed to comfort without display. A book lay closed beside his plate, its corner neatly aligned with the edge of the cloth, and the hand that moved to lift his cup was steady, well-kept, and faintly ink-stained. "Pray do not let us disturb you," Holmes said, with a courteous inclination as the waiter drew back Watson's chair. "The car appears determined to throw us together, and I, for one, am disinclined to quarrel with its judgment." There was a soft glimmer of amusement in the stranger's eye at that, and after the briefest hesitation proper to a man well-bred but not forward, he invited them to share the table. Who knew now that this was the very name inscribed in the anonymous letter, felt the smallest tightening in his chest, a quiet dissonance between the genial figure before him and the inked words that had spoken, with such unnerving certainty, of danger to come. It is one thing to read of a predicted victim in the familiar room at Baker Street, with the fire low and London safely outside the window. It is quite another to sit opposite him while the tea is poured, and to discover, to one's discomfort, that one rather likes him. Their new acquaintance introduced himself as Mr. Arthur Latham, lately of Geneva and formerly connected, in a modest capacity as he phrased it, with a banking house of some standing. His manner carried a quiet humor, a readiness to be pleased rather than to impress, and within a few minutes Watson found himself listening with genuine interest as Latham spoke of the curious intimacy of long-distance trains, where one might breakfast beside a stranger on French soil and take supper with him under the shadow of the Alps. Holmes allowed the talk to drift there at first, adding only the occasional question, yet each was placed with such delicate precision that its direction could scarcely be felt. Did Mr. Latham travel often by this route? Had business or inclination drawn him to the Alpine Express on this particular evening, when the timetables, as Holmes mildly observed, offered several alternatives through Basel and Paris? Were his connections chiefly in Switzerland? Or did his concerns extend, perhaps, to London, and the riverside districts where certain old banking families still maintained their discreet offices above the fog? Latham answered readily enough, speaking of a quiet life divided between Geneva and a small house near the Thames, of a widowed sister in Surrey, and of an amiable weakness for winter scenery, which made the snowbound passes a recurring temptation. He laughed, in that self-deprecating way of the truly unassuming, that no one would ever think to write his movements into a novel, still less a letter that claimed to know the future. It was only as he reached for the sugar tongs that the small, uncanny moment arrived. "I confess," he said, "I chose this train for the very thing most people dislike, the long enclosed stretch through the tunnel after Lucerne. There is something oddly comforting, is there not, in being shut away from the world for exactly 10 minutes, as if time itself had been placed between brackets?" Watson felt his fingers tighten around his cup. The anonymous letter, now folded in Holmes's pocket, had spoken of a danger that would come to Arthur Latham in the bracketed minutes when the train is swallowed by the mountain. And as the wheels hummed softly beneath them, and the lamps cast their gentle circles of light, he could not escape the quiet certainty that the written future had already begun to lean toward the present. The night slid gently into memory, and the next day on the Alpine Express unfolded with the kind of quiet, ordered routine that can make even a mystery seem, for a time, like a dream one has decided not to remember. Breathe with me as we begin, and picture that narrow world of polished wood and soft carpets, rocking steadily between walls of snow and stone. Morning came not with fanfare, but with the subdued clink of china in the dining car, the low murmur of fellow passengers, and the faint hiss of steam that seemed to wrap the train in its own private fog. Watson, moving a little stiffly from the previous evening's tension, found a certain comfort in the ritual of breakfast: the silver pot of coffee, the warm rolls, the folded newspaper that slid toward him with the same inevitability as the passing miles beyond the window. Holmes, for his part, toyed with his food more than he ate it, his attention divided between the printed timetable by his plate and the landscape beyond, where the line had begun to climb in earnest into the mountains. The view shifted from gentle valleys to steeper slopes, from scattered farmhouses to dark ranks of fir trees, and then higher still to bare rock dusted with snow that caught the light like cold fire. It was, Watson reflected, the sort of scenery that invited contemplation, and perhaps that was why the carriage felt so full of silence, even with every seat occupied. They passed the late morning in small ways that belong to long journeys. A chapter of a novel here, a brief walk along the corridor there, a pause at a window to watch a narrow bridge slide away beneath them. "Settle in, get comfortable," the train itself seemed to say, with its steady rhythm and its promise of distance. Yet beneath that rhythm, the memory of the anonymous letter remained, like a line of print that refuses to blur even when the eyes grow tired. It was in the early afternoon, when the light had taken on that pale, almost translucent quality that comes before the sun slips behind a ridge, that the pattern of the day was interrupted, not with drama, but with a gentle knock at their compartment door. The sound was modest, almost apologetic, and yet Watson felt, quite irrationally, that it possessed the same particular weight as the pause before a conductor's baton falls. A uniformed railway steward stood in the doorway, cap in hand, his expression one of dutiful composure, touched with the faint curiosity of a man entrusted with something unusual. In his gloved fingers lay an envelope. "Forgive me, gentlemen," he said softly, in careful English. This was given to the chief conductor with instructions that it be handed to Mr. Golder. "Sherlock Holmes, precisely after we passed the viaduct at Wasson and before we enter the next tunnel." "We have just cleared the viaduct, sir." Holmes accepted the letter without visible surprise. though Watson saw the slight sharpening at the corners of his eyes, the almost imperceptible straightening of his shoulders. The envelope was of the same thin, good paper as the first, the address written in that same unremarkable, determined hand, which seemed to be doing its best to be forgotten by the eye. The steward, having discharged his task, withdrew with a little bow, leaving behind a tiny eddy in the carriage's calm, like the swirl of air that lingers after a door has closed. For a moment Holmes merely weighed the envelope in his fingers, his gaze drifting to the window where the mountains reared closer, their flanks already shadowed, though the sky above remained clear. Watson realized, with a faint start, that his own breathing had grown shallower, as though the air in the compartment had quietly thinned. There was nothing here to alarm a man, he told himself, no raised voices, no danger that could be pointed to with a steady finger. And yet the timing, the precision of it, the way the letter had arrived at a particular stretch of track between named landmarks, suggested a mind that had mapped their progress with intimate care. Another prophecy, then, Watson ventured, striving for a lightness that did not quite reach his voice. "Not prophecy, Watson," Holmes murmured, and now he broke the seal with that delicate, almost musical crackle of paper that always made Watson think of cases beginning or ending or turning in some subtle way. A timetable, perhaps. Let us see how our anonymous dramatist chooses to arrange his acts. He unfolded the single sheet within. Watson, unable to resist, leaned forward, catching the faint scent of ink and something else upon the paper, something that put him in mind of coal smoke and cold station platforms. The handwriting was again neat, again restrained, and yet the words themselves seemed to lean toward them with a curious urgency. To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Holmes read softly, "You are now beyond the point of no return. At exactly 3:47 this afternoon, in the longest of the mountain tunnels yet to come, Arthur Latham will pass from the realm of diplomatic inconvenience into that of permanent silence. You will understand when the time comes why the darkness is required. You may warn him, if you wish. It will make no difference. The future does not yield to the protests of those it carries." Holmes paused, then continued, his tone still even, though Watson fancied he heard a new thread of interest woven through it. "You will find, when you speak with the railway authorities, that only 3 men on this train know the exact duration of that tunnel and the slight, unsignaled reduction in speed that occurs within it. Yet I am able to write to you of the minute and the manner before it happens. Consider, if you are inclined to skepticism, how such knowledge might be obtained." The letter ended as the first had ended, without signature, without flourish, the words simply ceasing as though the writer had stepped quietly out of the room between one breath and the next. Holmes read the final line twice, then folded the sheet with careful precision and slipped it back into its envelope. Watson felt a chill then, not the bodily shiver that comes from a draft under a door, but a more delicate sensation, as though some previously comfortable assumption had been withdrawn from under his thoughts. The author knew the timetable of the line, the private habits of the railway, and the name and position of their endangered diplomat. More unsettling still, the instructions about the viaduct, the exact moment of delivery, implied that this unseen correspondent was tracking their movement in real time. He glanced almost involuntarily toward the corridor, where the muffled passage of footsteps could be heard from time to time, and beyond that to the other compartments, where their fellow passengers sat reading, dozing, or watching the scenery with that peculiar absorption of travelers who believe themselves unobserved. Was the writer among them hidden behind a newspaper, or a veil, or a pair of spectacles that caught the light just so? Holmes seemed to follow his thought, for a faint, wry smile touched his lips, though his eyes remained thoughtful. "You perceive it, Watson," he said quietly. "Our correspondent is no distant oracle, composing from the safety of some London room and trusting to the post. He or she is close enough to our journey to mark its stages, to exploit the small confidences of railway staff, perhaps even to listen at the very doors through which these letters pass. Outside, the line curved, and for a brief moment the window offered a view of the train itself, snaking along the mountainside, its plume of steam trailing like a soft white question mark against the darker rock. It was, Watson thought, a strangely fitting image. "The circle is tightening," Holmes went on, his voice low, almost reflective, "but not, as our dramatist would have us believe, around the intended victim. No, Watson. It tightens around the mind that imagines it can script the future from the shelter of anonymity, as though the world were a stage and the rest of us merely actors who have obligingly forgotten our own lines." He settled back against the cushioned seat, fingertips together, the envelope resting lightly upon his knee. Soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, Watson found himself thinking, with a trace of irony, for there was nothing in this neat little drama that invited sleep. And yet, in the warmth of the compartment, with the steady motion of the train and the dimming light outside, he felt that curious, paradoxical calm that sometimes comes when events move beyond one's control, and all that remains is to watch, and to reason, and to wait for the next turn of the track. 3:47, Holmes murmured, glancing at his watch. "We have, I think, just enough time to speak with our fellow travelers before the mountain swallows us once more." And with that, the future, so confidently inscribed in anonymous ink, seemed to draw a little nearer, like the dark mouth of a tunnel growing slowly in the frame of a window that had, until now, shown only light. The corridor received them with a kind of padded quiet, the muffled thrum of the wheels coming up through carpet and polished wood, so that each step seemed to float a little, as if the train itself wished to help them glide along. "I invite you to settle in, get comfortable as we follow them, for there is something oddly soothing in the sight of Holmes taking exercise, his mind moving as gently and inevitably as the carriages along their rails," Holmes announced, in that mild tone which deceived no one who knew him, that he must stretch his legs. And so they set off, Watson a pace behind, while the corridor lamps made small islands of yellow upon brass fittings and frosted glass. His gaze, apparently idle, passed over the numbered doors, over the leather straps and the neat brass letter slots set beside certain compartments. Those tiny mouths through which private anxieties and public business slipped into the custody of the railway and the post. Here a slot showed a faint smear of fresh ink. There another bore the rectangular shadow where an envelope had recently rested before being collected. At one door he paused only long enough to note the overlapping luggage labels, Paris and Basel and London, layered like the rings of a tree, the most recent tag written in a compact, educated hand that wasted no curve and no stroke. At another, a trunk bore the stencil of a Swiss banking house, its corner darkened by what might have been sealing wax, what might have been no more than spilled candle. Yet Holmes's attention lingered the fraction of a second that told Watson it had joined some quiet ledger in his mind. A passing gentleman, his cuffs otherwise immaculate, carried on his fingers the faint rust of red wax and a bluish shadow of ink about the nail. A lady's maid, slipping from one room to another, shielded a folded paper at her apron with the unconscious protectiveness of long practice. They reached the far end, where a narrow window showed the snow streaming past in soft diagonal lines, as though the night were being gently written upon in white. Holmes stood there a moment, listening to the rhythm of the train, the steady, almost sleepy beat that seemed to breathe with him as he thought, and then without comment turned back toward their compartment, his inspection apparently complete. Inside, the room received them with its familiar cocoon of warmth and lamplight, the cushions still holding the shape of their earlier conversation. Watson closed the door, and the thin, companionable silence that followed had that particular texture he had come to recognize, like the pause before a conductor's baton falls. Outside, the world was fog and snow and the faint reflection of the lamp in the window. Inside, Holmes's profile was cut cleanly against the glass. "Well, Watson," he said at last, "our letter writer is no prophet, but he is, I think, a person of some education, and of a very practical turn of mind." The statement was delivered as calmly as if he remarked upon the tea. Watson, whose own thoughts had been moving in less defined circles, leaned forward. "You have found something in the corridor that points to him?"
"Not to him, perhaps, but to his habits," Holmes replied.
"We are dealing with one who understands timetables as a composer understands his score. He knows the rhythm of the post, the intervals of the rails, the little hesitations and accelerations by which letters overtake men and men overtake events. Such a man would be familiar with both postal and police arrangements. He must have access to information that the ordinary traveler, lulled by the promise of sleep and the comfort of the dining car, never suspects is moving alongside him." Watson considered this, watching the snow blur the world beyond the window into a soft, white indistinctness. Yet even with such knowledge, he said slowly, how could he predict, with that eerie precision, what has not yet occurred? To know a train will enter a tunnel at a certain minute is one thing. To know what a man will say or where a hand will fall seems quite another. Holmes's eyes, reflecting the lamplight, had the distant focus Watson associated with the more intricate problems. "There are, as you know, 3 possibilities," he murmured. "Prophecy, coincidence, or design. Of the first I know nothing. Of the second I do not believe. The third, therefore, must be our working hypothesis." He let the words drift into the quiet between them, then added, with a softness that made Watson's skin stir, "But if it is design, my dear fellow, then someone upon this train is arranging the future as carefully as a letter is addressed, and we have not yet seen the most important envelope." The train gave a gentle sway, like a sleeper turning in bed, and somewhere down the corridor a door clicked softly. Watson found himself listening, quite irrationally, for the sound of a pen upon paper, and wondering, with a small chill that the compartment's warmth could not entirely dispel, whether the next prediction had already been written, and for whose eyes it was meant. Holmes did not answer Watson's unspoken question. Instead, he drew both letters from their envelope with a motion so quiet that it seemed merely a continuation of the train's own gentle sway, and laid them side by side upon the narrow table between them. The compartment was a small room of polished wood and muted upholstery, a kind of moving study, and he made of the table a temporary desk, weighting each curling corner with whatever came to hand, a teacup half filled with cooled Darjeeling, the squat sugar bowl, his pocket knife laid flat like a miniature paperweight forged for the purpose. The lamps above them hummed softly, and the snow beyond the window slid past in a pale, unbroken scroll. Holmes's long fingers hovered for a moment over the nearer sheet, not yet touching, as though he were feeling for some current in the air. Then, with that particular delicacy which Watson had seen him apply to both Stradivarius strings and suspicious footprints, he passed his fingertips along the paper's edge and down its center, and finally across the body where the ink lay. The paper, he remarked, had a certain tooth to it, a faint resistance under the pad of the finger, neither the cheap, pulpy sort favored by tradesmen's circulars, nor the satin-smooth luxury beloved of Mayfair note-writers. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, lifting the first letter to the lamp so that the light shone through it. A ghostly emblem bloomed within the fibers, like a faint heraldic device glimpsed through fog. There, just below the fold. Do you see the watermark? Watson, leaning closer, saw at last a tiny shield enclosing the stylized curve of a river, and beneath it the suggestion of a bridge. Holmes's eyes warmed with quiet satisfaction. A Thames-side stationer, then, and not one of the great houses either, but a smaller firm that supplied certain government offices, and the more meticulous sort of clerk who liked his paper to suggest reliability rather than splendor. He set that sheet down and repeated the procedure with the second, and when the same pale device appeared, Watson felt the first solid thread of continuity draw tight between the two missives. It was a small thing, almost absurdly domestic in its nature. And yet, how many grand conspiracies had Holmes unpicked by means of a boot scrape or a cigar ash? "Settle in, get comfortable," he would sometimes say on winter evenings. "For the fate of empires may hang upon a speck of mud." Now he opened his traveling case, that modest leather box which had, over the years, produced an astonishing variety of small scientific marvels. From a padded groove he drew a tiny glass vial and a folded strip of white card. A single drop of pale reagent fell upon the card, the room filled with the faint, clean scent of alcohol and something sharper beneath. With a very soft touch, he brushed the moistened card against a stroke of ink on the margin where the words did not matter. "The ink is iron gall," he said, watching the color bloom and then darken, but with an admixture of aniline blue, a modern commercial preparation. Not the stodgy concoction one finds in old-fashioned ledgers, and not the cheap fluid hawked at street corners either. We may, I think, exclude the village parson and the errand boy. There was the slightest curve at the corner of his mouth. Even on the Alpine Express, forgery and fraud apparently preferred a respectable stationer. Watson, breathing with him as if to steady his own thoughts, found his curiosity sharpening. "So our prophet shops in London, uses decent paper, and writes with a clerk's ink. It is not much of a portrait." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, lowering his face until his aquiline nose nearly brushed the page. "We have not yet asked what the paper has breathed." It was an odd phrase, but before Watson could frame a question, Holmes inhaled gently along the margin of the first sheet, then the second, his eyes half closed as though listening to a distant melody. Outside, the train entered a stretch of cutting. The snow walls rose, the sound of the wheels changed timbre, and the compartment grew for a moment more intimate, like a smaller room nested within the larger. "There is the usual odor of ink and fibers," he said slowly, "and, as with many letters that pass through London, a general haze of coal smoke. But note, Watson, the quality of it. This is not the coarse, sooty reek of the big termini. There is a drier note, almost metallic. I have smelt it most often in offices that sit close to the river, where the smaller works burn a different grade of coal. Our stationer's premises, or our writer's desk, stands not far from such a place." He moved to the second letter, and here his expression altered just perceptibly. "And in addition," he murmured, a faint cologne. Not one of your florid concoctions advertised to young clerks, but a restrained citrus with a trace of vetiver. Middle class, professional, a man who wishes to be well-groomed without appearing to try. A solicitor's assistant, perhaps, or a confidential clerk in a government office. You see how the outline sharpens? Watson sat back, letting the rhythm of the train and the soft ticking of the compartment's little clock wash around him. Ink, paper, watermark, scent, each by itself a trifle so small that a tired mind might overlook it. Yet, together they began to suggest a very particular sort of unseen hand bending over a desk somewhere in London's great maze of rooms and windows and quiet fires. Was it not curious, he wondered, that a letter which claimed to know the future should reveal so much of its own past? Soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts often turned, in Holmes's company, upon such domestic minutiae, and Watson felt again that mingled comfort and unease which came from watching him summon a human figure out of fibers and fumes. The train rolled on through snow and rock, a dark thread stitching its way between mountains, and in that moving cocoon of warmth and lamplight, the mystery of the prophetic hand grew at once more intimate and more elusive. Somewhere ahead, another envelope might already be waiting, its paper breathing its own quiet secrets, and Holmes, eyes half-lidded, seemed to be listening for it, as one listens for a knock upon a familiar door that has not yet sounded. It surely will. Breathe with me as we begin to follow those secrets into their next deeper shadow. For if ink and paper could speak this much, what might the sender's choice of timing, of messenger, of route along these winter rails yet tell us, before sleep or danger overtook the Alpine Express and all who traveled within it? And so, as the Alpine Express slid on into the whitening dusk, we follow Holmes not into speculation, but into the quiet, measured country of timetables and iron rails, where the future is written not in stars, but in small black figures upon thin, folding paper. In the lamplit compartment, with the soft sway of the carriage like a slow breath beneath us, Holmes had spread upon his knees a much-folded railway timetable, its creases whitened, its corners softened by use, as though it were an old acquaintance rather than a mere document. His long finger moved with unhurried precision along the columns, pausing where times and place names met, tracing a path from London to Basel, then back again to a particular sequence of tunnels and bridges that stitched the Alps together like dark islets in a pale winter shoe. Watson, watching, felt again that familiar sensation, as though the room itself leaned in to see what Holmes would do next. The windows showed only their own reflections against the outside fog of snow. The quiet rhythm of the wheels, a soft ticking under the more delicate ticking of the little brass clock above the door. "You see, Watson," Holmes murmured without raising his eyes, "the prophets of our age are the clerks who compile these modest tables. They tell us to the minute where hundreds of souls will be, and when they will be least able to see one another clearly." He spoke then, in that calm, almost lecturing tone which had so often carried Watson toward peaceful sleep over the embers of the Baker Street fire, explaining how such schedules could be bent to darker uses. A man who knows that at 9:17 a train enters a long tunnel, and at 9:23 emerges again into daylight, also knows that for 6 whole minutes sight is curtailed, sound is swallowed by echo, and witnesses are reduced to vague impressions and muffled shapes. Within such carefully bounded darkness, an alibi may be manufactured, a disappearance contrived, a supposed miracle of foresight arranged with nothing more occult than punctual machinery and human habit. "Settle in, get comfortable," Holmes had once told a nervous client, "for the timetable is as comforting to the criminal as to the honest traveler. The memory brushed Watson's mind now with a quiet, wry warmth as he listened. Letters that predicted crimes, telegrams that seemed to anticipate events by hours. How many of them, he wondered, had merely ridden upon the back of a known postal or railway interval, exploiting the same dependable clockwork that brought the evening paper to the breakfast room? Our correspondent, Holmes continued, tapping the letter that had begun this strange business, does not rely on supernatural foresight, but on the obedience of engines and of men. Trains keep to their times, conductors to their rounds, passengers to their dinner and their sleep. It is a simple matter to appear uncanny, when one knows in advance when the lights will dim, when the tunnel will swallow the windows, when the world beyond becomes a black mirror. Watson felt, with a small inward start, how the chill of the prophecy lessened when viewed in this soft, practical light. Machines and routines, not fate, lay behind the letter's confident tone. Holmes's finger came to rest at last upon a particular name, half hidden in the fold. "Here, Watson," he said quietly, "the Schwarzdahl Tunnel. Long, curved, poorly ventilated, with a gradient that slows the train. We shall be within it for nearly 8 minutes. If our unknown author intends to make his prediction good, this, I fancy, is his chosen stage." He folded the timetable with care, slid it into his pocket, and turned his face toward the darkening window. "When we reach that silence," he added, "we must be more awake than any prophet, and very ready indeed. Breathe with me as we begin to draw nearer to that tunnel, and to the moment when ink on paper will either be unmasked as trickery or prove itself, against all reason, to have known the future after all. Settle in, get comfortable, because as the Alpine Express slides toward its appointed darkness, Holmes's thoughts turn not to shadows and tunnels, but to the quieter shadows that live inside human intention. They had taken an early supper in the dining car, a soft little island of linen and lamplight, where the windows showed only their own reflections and the suggestion of snow beyond, like fog pressed against glass. The room held a gentle warmth, the kind that makes even a hard wooden chair seem almost like an armchair by the fire, and Watson, with his second cup of coffee cooling at his elbow, watched Holmes stir his tea with absent precision. "It is a curious preference, is it not?" Holmes observed at length. "To predict a crime rather than to commit it, or to prevent it." His tone was mild, but Watson had learned to recognize that particular quality of quiet, that sense that the mind behind those gray eyes was already 3 stations ahead on the timetable. One does not announce the weather unless one has some interest in the picnic. Watson smiled, the line of steam from his cup rising between them like a small private fog. "You mean someone profits more from the prophecy than from the deed itself?" "Precisely. Consider blackmail." Holmes set down his spoon with the care of a man placing a piece on a chessboard. A letter that seems to know the future is a wonderfully economical instrument. Our author foretells misfortune, allows some small staged event to occur exactly as written, and thus establishes a reputation. Thereafter, those who receive such communications may be invited to pay for protection from what is, in truth, nothing more supernatural than a man with a timetable and a certain want of scruple. Watson pictured it, an anxious merchant, a nervous heiress, a widow already inclined to sleep poorly, each staring at a sheet of paper that seemed to lean forward from the desk. "And once the first prediction comes true," he murmured, "the rest require no more than ink and postage. Victorian efficiency in the service of terror." Holmes's lips twitched, the closest he came to laughter when working. The postman as unwitting accomplice. I have seen stranger partnerships. He lifted the letter once more, letting it rest in his long fingers. Then there is inheritance, a death that appears to be the fulfillment of some written fate, or an unfortunate accident long foretold, draws far less scrutiny than a death which seems the direct consequence of another's clear design. People accept the inevitable with a resignation they rarely extend to murder. Watson thought of wills folded into envelopes, of distant cousins who suddenly found railway timetables fascinating. If an elderly gentleman, for example, has been warned that his heart will fail on a particular journey, he said slowly, and does indeed die between stations, who questions it? The letter has already done the work of persuading everyone that the event belonged to the future, not to a human hand. And finally, Holmes continued, his gaze drifting to the dark pane beside them, where their reflections rode in a kind of moving silence. We must not neglect the alibi. A prophet who has carefully warned of disaster may later present himself as the one person we can safely exclude. After all, who suspects the man who tried to prevent the crime? Who indeed? Watson echoed a little grimly. The idea that a warning could serve as a shield, as neat and polished as a silver watch case, sat uneasily with him. Our correspondent, then, may be arranging not only the appearance of fate, but the appearance of innocence. The train gave a soft, rhythmic sway, as though agreeing. Somewhere further along the corridor, a door clicked shut, and the faint murmur of another conversation rose and fell like distant waves. "Tell me, Holmes," Watson said, lowering his voice without quite knowing why, "do you believe the writer is on this train now, watching to see whether his design unfolds as written? Or is he sitting comfortably by his own fire in London, trusting schedules and human nature to carry out his script while he sleeps?" Holmes did not answer at once. His reflection in the window seemed to lean closer, as if conferring with the night beyond. When he spoke, it was very soft. "That, Watson, depends upon one small detail in the letter which we have not yet discussed." He turned the page over with a fingertip, and Watson felt quite distinctly the room grow quieter, as though the very air were waiting to hear what that detail might be. He did not at once enlighten Watson, for the next phase of the inquiry, as he conceived it, could not be argued in the quiet of a London room, but must be lived out, minute by minute, upon the moving stage the letter had so confidently described. "So, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin to follow them into that soft, snowbound world of the Alpine Express, where time itself seemed to glide along the rails." Watson, watching Holmes in the corridor that first evening, became aware of a new quality in his friend's composure, a kind of deliberate stillness, as though every gesture had been weighed before it was granted to the air. The predicted victim, a mild civil servant whose name the letter had coolly underlined, was invited to join them for tea in the dining car, not at his habitual hour, but a little earlier, with Holmes's suggestion wrapped in such quiet courtesy that it felt less like strategy and more like companionship on a long journey. A remark about the better view from another compartment, an offer to exchange seats so that the gentleman might have the window, a casual proposal that they walk together rather than alone. Each change was no more than a feather's touch upon the evening's pattern. To Watson, who knew his friend too well to be deceived, those feathers formed a net. When the other man had gone, Holmes leaned back, his eyes following the reflection of the lamps in the darkening glass. "If our correspondent has truly seen the future," he murmured, "then these diversions will be as raindrops upon the river. But if he has merely arranged a series of conditions, like scenery in a theater, then the smallest shift in furniture may send his curtain tumbling down." The train itself, with its polished brass and gentle swaying, became an accomplice in the experiment. Holmes spoke softly with Conductor Hoffman, his tone no more urgent than a man discussing the merits of one brand of tobacco over another. Yet when they next passed along the corridor, Watson noticed an extra lamp burning outside the relevant compartment, its circle of light turning the panel into a small, watchful sun. A door that was usually shut now stood a finger's breadth ajar, at Holmes's quiet request that the staff ensure a freer circulation of air. A steward, all discretion and white cuffs, consulted a seating plan and, by some innocent rearrangement, placed their marked man within easy sight of Holmes's chair. There was, for a time, an almost domestic comfort in it all, as though they had merely rearranged a sitting room before a long talk by the fire. Yet beneath the warmth of the carriage lamps Watson felt another current, cool and insistent. Could a letter dictate events if every hinge and handle along its chosen path were touched by Holmes's hand? Or would the future prove, like good ink and bad intentions, stubbornly resistant to alteration? The pattern of the rails beneath them supplied no answer. The train slid through pockets of fog and moonlit snowfields, each tunnel encutting a slow inhalation and exhalation of darkness and light. And in Watson's mind, the steady rhythm ceased to be mere motion and became instead the ticking of an immense mechanical clock. The appointed hour named in the letter lay somewhere ahead, fixed upon the timetable like a pin through a moth. And with every soft clatter of the wheels, he felt them drawn nearer, not racing, but gliding, inescapably, toward whatever the future, human or otherwise, had prepared. These were, after all, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts. Yet as the lamps burned low and the carriage settled toward sleep, the question remained, quiet but insistent. At the back of Watson's mind, was Holmes guiding the night, or was the night guiding them? And as the clock of the train carried them on, he could not shake the sense that the next small decision, a seat taken, a door closed, a word spoken too soon or too late, might be the one that would either shatter the prophecy or, with terrible gentleness, carry you toward peaceful sleep and the very scene the letter had foretold. Watson would later reflect that the hour did not so much arrive as gather, the way fog will thicken outside a window until one suddenly realizes the world beyond has quite disappeared. The prophecy in the letter had named a time, an ordinary figure on a timetable. Yet as the minutes drew near, the quiet of the carriage seemed to lean toward it, like a room listening for a footstep on the stair. Outside, twilight deepened with that particular swiftness of winter latitudes, the snow no longer a scattered decoration on the fields, but a soft, persistent veil that blurred hedgerows, signal posts, and distant farm lights into one continuous band of pale uncertainty. Within their compartment, the lamps answered the encroaching dark with a warmer glow. The glass chimneys faintly clouded, the brass fittings catching and returning small, steady points of fire, until Holmes and Watson were held in a moving island of gentle light, rocked by the rhythm of the rails. "Settle in, get comfortable," Holmes had murmured earlier to a nervous fellow passenger in the corridor, and Watson, remembering it now, found the phrase quietly ironic, for the entire train seemed to be doing the opposite. The air held that particular tension that precedes a storm, or a diagnosis, or the moment when a letter is finally opened. "Breathe with me as we begin," he thought wryly, aware that his own pulse had chosen a livelier tempo than the situation, on the surface, appeared to warrant. The line ahead curved toward the black mouth of the tunnel, a darker absence in the gathering dusk, briefly visible between curtains as the train swung. Snowflakes, caught in the last of the day, whirled like sparks from an invisible grate, then vanished as the engine, with a soft roar and a subtle lowering of tone, plunged them into rock and darkness. The windows ceased to be windows at all and became mirrors, returning to Watson his own face, Holmes's lean profile, the dim reflection of their lamp more real, for the moment, than the unseen stone rushing inches beyond the glass. It was then, almost to the minute the letter had specified, that the disturbance came. Not a scream, not anything that might truly trouble sleep, but a muffled cry, quickly smothered, followed by a dull thump somewhere in the corridor, as if a suitcase had slipped from a rack, or a man had misjudged his footing on the gently swaying floor. At the same instant, their lamp flickered, dimmed to a sallow ghost of itself, and then recovered with a small, apologetic tremor. Holmes was on his feet before the light had fully steadied, his movements, as always, possessing more decision than haste. "Bring the hand lantern, Watson," he said, in that level tone which made obedience feel less like an order and more like the natural continuation of one's own thought. The doctor complied, fingers closing around the cool metal, the little pool of additional light somehow reassuring against the close, humming silence of the tunnel. They stepped into the corridor together, the carriage swaying with a slow, almost lulling insistence beneath their feet, the wheels beating out a steady, untroubled rhythm that argued in its own mechanical way that nothing at all was amiss. Doors were closed, curtains drawn, a line of quiet, self-contained rooms gliding through the dark. Yet the letter had spoken, the hour had come, and the air smelled faintly of coal smoke and something else. A disturbance, as intangible as a change of mood. Near the compartment of the predicted victim, that illusion of complete order began to fray. One door stood not quite shut, breathing open and closed with each gentle sway of the train, its latch clicking softly like teeth in a dream. On the carpet of the corridor, a small object lay where it had no business to be, glinting faintly in the lantern's beam, and from within the half-open room there came no answering sound at all. Holmes lifted a hand to still Watson's next step, his eyes narrowing with that particular intensity that always meant some tiny, decisive detail had presented itself. The train rushed on through the unseen rock, the lamp flame steadied, and in that suspended moment between knowledge and confirmation, Watson felt the prophecy and the present at last touch. Something had happened. But what, and to whom, and by whose carefully timed design remained, for one more breath, to be discovered on the other side of that gently moving door. The door yielded with its usual, almost apologetic click, and for a breath the little compartment beyond looked precisely as it had when Watson had last seen it, as though the tunnel and the prophecy and the deepening rattle of the train had all been part of some private dream. Then his eye caught the human note that dreamscapes never quite manage, the pale, strained face of Miss Lydia Fairchild, and the way her gloved hands clutched at empty air where something precious ought to have been. Settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin to trace what, in truth, had vanished in the dark. For there was no body on the cushioned bench, no stillness that spoke of anything more than a young woman's shaken nerves and the odd, unsettled silence that follows a sudden fright. Miss Fairchild was very much alive, her chest rising quickly beneath her traveling cloak, her eyes bright with unshed tears, yet beside her lay an open jewel case, its satin-lined interior as bare as a winter garden. Watson's gaze moved slowly around the room, that gentle, trained sweep of a man who has seen too much suffering to be easily deceived by its counterfeits. The cushions on the opposite seat were slightly displaced, as if some careful weight had rested there for a moment and then withdrawn. One of the brass window latches stood a fraction askew, not flung wide, merely disturbed, like a button done up in haste. And in the air beneath the familiar coal and steam of the train, there lingered a faint thread of scent, unfamiliar cologne, or perhaps a particular tobacco, sweet and foreign, that did not belong to Miss Fairchild or to the quiet, practical maid who hovered near her. She tried to speak at once, but the words came unevenly, in little starts and rushes, as though they too were finding their way out of a tunnel. During the darkness, she said, she had felt a slight change in the air, a cool draft that slipped along the floor and up about her ankles, though the window had surely been closed. There had been, she thought, the softest sound in the corridor, not quite a step, more like the brushing of cloth. Once, only once, a shadow had seemed to pass across the thin line of light beneath the door. She had told herself it was her imagination. After all, what could happen in so few minutes, in a locked compartment, on a train full of people? Now her family's heirloom diamonds were gone, taken from the locked jewel case that had rested in her traveling bag, itself secured beneath the seat. No hand had touched her, no threat had been uttered, yet the letter's cold assurance that a crime would strike this very carriage during the longest tunnel had, in its fashion, been fulfilled. Watson felt an involuntary sigh escape him, a soft exhalation of relief that tasted almost of guilt. No life had been claimed, no blood darkened the neat upholstery. The scene was one of loss and dismay, rather than anything that would trouble the sleep of the stoutest listener. And yet, as he watched Holmes move with that quiet, economical precision from latch to cushion to discarded case, he understood that the stakes, though gentler to the eye, were no less real to the mind. Someone had used the letter as both threat and curtain, a way to choreograph fear and opportunity with the tidy confidence of a man consulting a railway timetable. Holmes straightened at last, his fingers resting for a moment on the edge of the window frame, as if feeling for the echo of the draft Miss Fairchild had described. The lamp caught his profile, the familiar aquiline line of nose and brow, and Watson saw there not alarm, but a kind of grave satisfaction, the look of a chess player whose opponent has finally moved a long-anticipated piece. "Pray compose yourself, Miss Fairchild," Holmes said, his tone so soft that it seemed to add warmth to the small room. "What has been taken can be traced. Jewels leave as clear a trail as ink and paper, to those who know where to look. Our correspondent who seeks to play master of the future has, in truth, merely supplied us with more threads to follow. We shall see, before this journey ends, whether his knowledge runs ahead of events, or only scurries behind them with a pocket watch and a timetable." Outside, beyond the fogged window, the darkness of the tunnel began at last to thin, and the first suggestion of gray daylight slipped into the carriage, as if the world itself were leaning closer to hear what Holmes would do next, and to which unseen room his reasoning would quietly lead them. These are soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, to carry you toward peaceful sleep even as the puzzle sharpens, piece by gentle piece. The darkness lifted from the carriage windows in slow degrees, and with it the first phase of Holmes's plan seemed to rise into clearer outline, as if the thinning fog outside were in sympathy with the ordered fog within his mind. He rose without haste, consulted his watch, and suggested in that quiet way which was somehow more compelling than any command, that they should now make a round of the train. Watson, who had long since learned to recognize this particular calm as the herald of methodical activity, put aside his cup and followed, the corridor's soft carpet yielding underfoot, the glass of each compartment door reflecting a pale version of his own thoughtful face as they passed. "Settle in, get comfortable," the scene itself seemed to murmur, for this would not be a dash of excitement but a slow, circling inquiry. Their first calls were upon the passengers already known to us. With the Countess von Albrecht, Holmes's questions came like the ticking of a well-regulated clock, where she had been when the letter's prediction was first discussed. What she had observed of the missing agent's manner, whether any mention had been made of the postal arrangements that had so unnerved Inspector Müller. Each inquiry was followed by a gentle reassurance, a soft word about routine, about the Swiss authorities' discretion, so that the lady's hands, which had begun the interview tightly knotted, lay at its close quite still upon the rug. It was in leaving her compartment that Watson noticed the first small clue of the circuit, a faint smudge of coal dust upon the cuff of a fellow passenger, who squeezed past in the narrow corridor, his apology murmured in excellent, if overly elaborate, English. Holmes's gaze dipped once, briefly, to that dark mark, then moved on. But Watson, who had come to read such glances almost as one reads print, filed it away in his own mind with a quiet little thrill. So the pattern began. They spoke with a porter, with the steward from the dining car, with the watchful governess whose eyes missed nothing, and yet who insisted, with a hint of gently wry humor, that she had seen only children and cocoa and a great deal of steam. Between each interview, the train itself offered its commentary. A pair of damp footprints slowly fading along the corridor runner, though no snow had been tracked in for some time. A scrap of cream paper, of unusually fine texture, caught beneath the door of an unoccupied compartment, its torn edge bearing the ghost of a watermark that made Holmes's brows draw together in interest. At measured intervals they returned to their own small room, where the window showed the winter landscape sliding by in soft grays and whites, and the little table between the seats became, in Watson's eyes, a kind of domestic council board. The steward brought fresh tea, and the steam from the pot mingled with the faint scent of coal from the engine, calling to mind the London post offices whose time deliveries had made the letter's prophecy so plausible. Breathe with me as we begin this next quiet turn of the wheel. Observe, deduce, explain, reflect. Holmes would spread their findings as if they were cards in some intricate game. Here, the coal dust, suggesting recent contact with the tender or with a particular kind of stationer's stove. There, the damp footprints, placed too evenly to be the careless traces of a single hurried journey. And beside them, the scrap of paper, whose texture and watermark linked it, in his measured opinion, to a small class of riverside stationers in London. His voice never rose, yet each calmly spoken connection seemed to Watson like another log laid upon an invisible fire, the warmth of understanding slowly building. In those pauses, with the cups cooling between them and the soft rhythm of the wheels beneath, Watson's admiration became its own steady refrain. He watched the way Holmes's long fingers hovered just above the evidence, not quite touching, as though contact might disturb some delicate alignment of thought, and he felt, as he had so often felt, that however tangled the present appeared, the future explanation was already taking quiet shape behind those gray eyes. Then the cycle would begin anew, back into the corridor, where the fading footprints had now almost vanished into the runner's pattern, leaving only the memory of their damp outline. Another compartment, another series of gently phrased questions, another reassurance that nothing would be disturbed more than necessary. Each loop of this soft-spoken orbit brought them a fraction closer to the heart of the letter's mystery, and yet the movement was so even, so lacking in any suddenness, that one might almost have believed they were merely passing the time until sleep. It was on their third return, when Holmes paused with his hand upon their compartment door, that the pattern shifted by the smallest, yet most telling degree. For there, upon the table where no one but the steward had been, lay a second scrap of that same distinctive paper, and upon it, in a hand Watson knew all too well, a new line had been written, calmly predicting an event that had not yet and perhaps need not ever come to pass. Watson's first sensation was of the quiet, almost domestic wrongness of it, as if someone had slipped a stranger's teacup onto their familiar breakfast tray, and Holmes's fingers, light upon the paper, conveyed more concern than his composed features would ever willingly betray. He did not speak at once. Instead, he allowed the corridor's soft murmur to pass them by. Then, with a small inclination of the head, guided Watson and the others toward the far end of the dining car, to that little alcove where the lamps burned low and the window showed only their own reflections framed by night. It was there, in that makeshift room of polished wood and linen, that he gathered them, the inspector, the anxious cousin of the victim, the ink-stained timetable clerk who had professed such innocent enthusiasm for railway minutiae, and the steward, whose hands had been everywhere and nowhere at once. Settle in, get comfortable, I might say to you now, for Watson himself felt that odd mixture of tension and drowsy warmth, the sort that comes when a puzzle is nearly done, and sleep lies just beyond it, waiting. He watched Holmes with that attentive stillness he had learned over the years, knowing that the particular quality of silence in the car meant an announcement was forming, like steam coiling before it finds its whistle. "It is time," Holmes began quietly, "to unmask our prophet." His gaze moved not to the most nervous face, nor to the most indignant, but to the man whose cuffs were permanently smudged with black, and whose pockets always seemed to rattle faintly with folded paper. The railway clerk, traveling incognito as a simple commercial agent, met that gaze for a heartbeat too long. Holmes laid the two scraps of paper side by side, turning them so the light fell across the fibers. "The watermark," he said, "is from a minor stationer by the riverside in London, whose stock is curiously perfumed by the coal smoke of the barges that pass his window. Our prophetic letters share not only that mark, but a faint scent of the same fog-laden air, and a trace of a particular cologne which our friend here favors rather more generously than his companions." The clerk's hand twitched, almost as if to check his own lapel. Watson recalled then how Holmes had slipped out at Charing Cross before their departure, under the pretext of a forgotten cigar case, and returned with that soft gleam in his eye which meant some tiny domestic fact had aligned with a theory. The ink, too, had told a story. A railway office mixture, slightly more viscous, chosen for ledgers that must endure constant handling. "You see," Holmes continued, his voice as even as the train's rhythm, "our correspondent required three things: knowledge of the intended victim's movements, access to my handwriting, and absolute faith in the timetables. The first he obtained through his position, the second from a discarded note I penned at the ticket office, and the third from the same printed schedules he pretended to admire purely as a hobby." Here he paused, and Watson felt the pattern shift, a small pattern interrupt in the gentle flow of words. Victorian London's post, Holmes said, almost conversationally, offered multiple deliveries a day. A letter posted at a particular hour from a particular district would reach Baker Street between my morning paper and my second cup of coffee with almost mechanical certainty. Add the precision of railway arrivals, and one may arrange for a letter to seem to outrun an event, when in truth it merely keeps pace with it. The clerk's face had taken on the sallow cast of a man watching his own carefully drawn map being traced back to its origin. "You never believed in fate," Holmes said gently, almost with a kind of sad respect. "You believed in control. By nudging a will here, an inheritance there, by making men and women trust in written destiny, you hoped to guide their choices and their fears. But prophecy is a fragile illusion, my dear sir. It depends upon the world behaving as you expect. The moment I altered a single condition, by remaining on this train, by refusing the path you had plotted, the future you had written began to unravel." Watson, listening, felt a quiet shiver, not of fear, but of recognition, as if some deeper truth about chance and choice had been softly laid before the fire of his understanding. "And you, if you breathe with me as we begin to leave this revelation behind, may feel it too, that these soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts are, in their way, reminders that no letter, however confidently penned, can fully carry you toward peaceful sleep, if a clear mind chooses otherwise." Outside, beyond the dim glass, the night pressed close, and the rails hummed on, bearing them toward the next necessary question. If the prophet was only a clerk with ink-stained fingers, then whose future, precisely, had he been so desperate to rewrite? The answer to that question, when it came, was not in the form of some new enigma, but in the very ordinary discovery of an umbrella stand. It stood at the end of the corridor, a modest piece of furniture in bent wood and brass, bearing the damp scent of snow shaken from cloaks and the faint tang of coal dust that drifted each time a door opened toward the engine. And there, slid neatly behind its curved back, lay the missing dispatch case, its worn leather as composed as if it had merely stepped aside for a moment's quiet. Holmes, who had guided the small search party with an air of unhurried inevitability, did not pounce upon it as a more theatrical detective might have done, but merely inclined his head to Conductor Hoffman, inviting him with that subtle courtesy which disarmed pride, to lift it free and examine the familiar monogram. "Intact, Herr Doctor," Hoffman murmured, turning to Piton, now reclaimed as Piton rather than Pemberton, with a look of almost paternal relief, and the diplomat, whose face had been drawn tight as a telegram wire, allowed the tension to soften, his shoulders sinking by a fraction as if some invisible valise had been removed from his back. He thanked Holmes in the manner of his class and time, with a warm but carefully measured pressure of the hand and a few low words about the service rendered to his country. Yet Watson, watching from his place by the corridor window, saw the slight brightening of the man's eyes, the way they lingered on the recovered papers as though they were not simply documents, but the restored outline of a future he had feared was lost. Holmes, for his part, accepted the gratitude as he might accept a cup of tea, with a small bow and a glance already drifting elsewhere. "Observation, Mr. Bow. Peyton," he said almost lightly. The case was too important to be thrown away, too incriminating to be kept close, and our friend required a place both communal and overlooked. An umbrella stand is the natural refuge of things which no one believes will move of their own accord. There was a faint, shared smile at that. Even Piton allowed himself the ghost of amusement, as if the very domesticity of the hiding place had smoothed the sharper edges of the affair. Outside, the train slipped past a signal lamp that painted the snow with a brief red glow, then left it once more to the soft, colorless night. Arrangements, in the discreet language of such matters, were made. At the next important junction, certain plain-clothed officials would join the Alpine Express, and a particular passenger, whose name Watson need not record, would discover that an urgent telegram required his presence off the train and into a quiet station room where Swiss and British interests could converse at length. No scandal would trouble the newspapers. No reputation would be publicly disturbed. The letter that had pretended to know the future would be folded away among other confidential curiosities, and the journey, this moving hotel of wood, brass, and gently swaying fabric, could resume its more innocent purpose of bearing strangers together through the darkness. Watson, returning to their compartment, felt the change almost at once. The corridor, which an hour before had been strung tight as a violin string, with whispers and watchful glances, now held that looser, sleepier air familiar to any night train. A door clicked softly here. A muffled cough sounded there. The low murmur of a couple discussing nothing in particular drifted like steam along the passage. He sat by the window, the glass cool beneath his fingertips, and watched his own reflection mingle with the faint outline of fir trees and distant snow-draped roofs. The Alpine Express, which had so recently seemed a stage for prophecy and peril, settled back into being simply itself again. A chain of warm lamplit rooms traveling through the cold, a place of pillows and folded rugs, and the small, stubborn routines of human comfort. In their compartment, the lamp threw a circle of soft gold over Holmes's profile as he lay stretched along the seat, eyes half closed, fingers loosely steepled, as if even his rest were a form of quiet calculation. The recovered papers, now sealed and safe, rested in Piton's locked valise somewhere down the corridor. The future, for the moment, belonged once more to timetables and human decisions, rather than to ink and superstition. "Settle in. Get comfortable, Watson," Holmes murmured without opening his eyes, and though the words were spoken to his friend, they seemed to Watson like an invitation to the whole drowsy carriage, a gentle permission for thoughts to uncoil. The wheels took up their steady, hypnotic refrain beneath them. The stove in the corner ticked as it settled. A faint scent of coal and polished wood gave the room that particular warmth which belongs only to enclosed spaces, moving through deep winter. Watson found his own breathing falling into rhythm with the motion of the train, each inhalation a small acceptance that the crisis had passed, each exhalation a letting go of the images that had so recently sharpened his mind to anxious wakefulness. These were, he reflected, the moments in which even a man accustomed to danger could allow himself to drift, to trust in the ordinary miracle of rails and schedules in competent hands unseen. If the letter had once claimed to command events yet to come, the present now felt reassuringly modest. A corridor lamp turned down, a blind drawn against the snow, a conductor's quiet footfall receding into the distance. The prophecy had been shown for what it was, clever timing and human fear intertwined, and in its place there remained only the simple, enduring story of people carried together through the night. Outside, the mountains rose in dark, patient ranks, their shapes just discernible against a sky where the stars seemed to tremble with cold. The Alpine Express slid onward, a narrow ribbon of light and life stitched through the great white silence, and one by one its compartments yielded to drowsy conversation, to the rustle of blankets, to the soft surrender of sleep. Breathe with me as we begin to leave this little drama behind, in with the remembered tension of missing papers and whispered suspicions, out, with the knowledge that reputations are preserved, that justice is quietly in motion, that no lasting wound has been dealt. These are soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts after all. And as the train's rhythm steadied into its most soothing tempo, Watson felt, as you may feel now, the mind's own express easing from inquiry into rest, from the bright light of deduction into the gentler glow of dreams that carry you toward peaceful sleep. Somewhere ahead lay another station, another letter, another problem waiting patiently at the edge of dawn. But for this stretch of the journey at least, the future could be allowed to arrive in its own time, without prediction, without haste, borne on the quiet rails of the night. And so, as the narrator's voice drifts back and away, we find ourselves once more in that quiet compartment, and I invite you to settle in, get comfortable, as the story narrows to two familiar figures and the soft ticking of the rails beneath them. Holmes and Watson sat opposite one another, alone at last, while the train slid through the winter darkness. The lamps turned low so that their light pooled gently upon the narrow table between them. Upon that small island of brightness lay the recovered letter, and its forged twin, side by side like relics of a little finished storm, their creased paper catching the glow in pale, uneven rectangles, as if even now they held some last, reluctant glimmer of the future they had pretended to command. Beyond the window, snow whispered against the glass, a steady, soothing hush, and inside the room of the compartment there was that particular warmth of worn upholstery and shared fatigue, the kind that invites reflection more than conversation. Watson, feeling the familiar drowse of the train and the day's exertions, watched his friend's profile for a time, the keen gray eyes lowered to the letters, the long fingers resting, for once, idle. He had learned over their years of companionship to recognize the texture of such silence, and it was that very quiet which prompted him at last. "Holmes," he said, his voice low so as not to disturb the soft peace of the corridor beyond, "do you never feel the temptation to believe in fate? We have had between Baker Street and these rails more than our share of perfectly timed letters, doors opening at the instant you require them, chance meetings in foggy streets. Even this business of a note describing a crime before it occurs, does it never seem to you that something larger has arranged the pattern?" Holmes did not answer at once. The train rocked them gently through some invisible curve, and the snow at the window thickened, blurring the world to a moving sheet of white. When he spoke, it was with that quiet thoughtfulness which Watson always found more arresting than his sharpest epigrams. "What men call fate," he said, "is very often no more than the intersection of their own choices, habits, and oversights. Our prophet of the post relied on the punctuality of the London mails, the rigidity of railway timetables, the laziness of officials who do not question a familiar watermark or a forged hand. To the untrained eye, the arrival of such a letter at precisely the right hour appears uncanny. To one who has studied ink, paper, and the little vices of character, it is merely the inevitable flowering of seeds long sown." Dioways beneath, he lifted one of the letters between finger and thumb, turning it toward the lamp so that the faint device in the paper showed itself. "This watermark, for example," he continued, with a trace of that gently wry amusement that so often hovered at the edge of his explanations, would be invisible to most recipients, who are content to tremble at the words and ignore the material that bears them. Yet it betrayed a particular riverside stationer whose back room smells of coal smoke and cheap cigars, and whose ledger will, I fancy, presently assist Inspector Lestrade in his report. Is that fate, Watson, or simply a man too confident that no one looks as closely as he does? Watson smiled, the expression small and a little weary, but genuine. Perhaps it is both, he said. Or perhaps it does not matter. There is, I confess, a certain comfort in knowing that what pretends to be prophecy can be reduced again to paper and ink, to timetables and human folly. Clear thinking and quiet observation, your methods, in short, have a way of turning the unknown back into the merely unexplained. It is easier to sleep beside a puzzle than beside a curse. As he said the word sleep, his gaze drifted for a moment to the window, where his own reflection floated faintly over the fog of snow and night. Just so, Holmes murmured. The unknown is a room in darkness. Logic merely has the good manners to light a lamp before entering. The train rolled on, rocking them toward their destination, each mile marked by the soft percussion of wheels and the low sigh of steam, carrying them and you on known rails through an otherwise uncertain landscape. In the corridor, a distant door clicked, then fell still. In their compartment, the letters lay motionless, their power spent, their secrets catalogued and filed in Holmes's orderly mind. For tonight at least, both men allowed themselves to be passengers rather than pursuers, borne forward by forces they need not direct, only trust. Watson's eyes grew heavy, his thoughts moving more slowly, like the snowflakes drifting past the glass. Yet somewhere beneath that gathering drowsiness, a small question remained, turning itself over with quiet persistence. If a letter could so nearly counterfeit the future with nothing more than human cunning and a knowledge of schedules, what might be done by someone with more imagination, more resources, and less scruple? The notion flickered at the edge of his mind, like a lamp seen far down the line, and as the train slid into a deeper darkness of tunnel and night, he could not quite shake the sense that another message, unwritten as yet but inevitable, was already on its way to Baker Street. The tunnel thinned, as all tunnels do, into a paler darkness, and the faint suggestion of a platform lamp slid across the carriage windows so that the reflections of Holmes and Watson wavered, blurred, and at last dissolved into your own. The soft rhythm of the wheels that had carried them through snow and secrecy becomes, now, the quieter rhythm of your own breath, rising and falling, as regular as a well-kept timetable, but with no train to catch and no connection to miss. If you let the image linger for a moment, you may still see them there. Holmes with his long limbs folded like a stork at rest, Watson with his notebook half closed upon his knee, the two of them sharing that companionable silence which, between old friends, says far more than talk. Outside, winter presses its cool face against a glass, and inside, the lamps cast their modest halos on polished wood, on brass fittings touched by 100 gloved hands, on the faint curl of steam that escapes a teacup and disappears into the dim, safe air of the compartment. The story has taken us through letters that claimed to know the future and minds that believed they could control it, through timetables and postmarks and the curious way a single envelope can alter the course of an evening, yet for all its twists, it has moved always toward the same quiet harbor, the reassuring triumph of reason over fear. Ink can be analyzed, paper traced, alibis tested against the clock, but in the end it is the human heart with its mixture of folly and courage that Holmes weighs most carefully, and that, perhaps, is why he so often prevails. Here, in your own room, there is no need to weigh anything. You may simply settle in, get comfortable, and allow the last echoes of the train to fade. There is nothing you must remember, no clue you are obliged to hold in the front of your mind, no puzzle waiting accusingly on the mantelpiece. If you drift away now, the story will go on without you, as all stories do, and you can return to it whenever you wish, at whatever station your waking thoughts alight. Breathe with me as we begin to leave them behind. A slow breath in, as if drawing in the faint scent of coal and snow from a half-opened window, and a longer breath out, letting the carriage, the corridor, the distant guard's whistle recede into a soft, velvety distance. If sleep comes halfway through that breath, let it. You are under no obligation to see the final page. Holmes will manage perfectly well without an audience, and Watson, who has sat through many a doze of his own in that armchair by the fire, would be the last man to take offense. If you find that you enjoy these soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, you are always welcome to return for more long, cozy mysteries, more winter trains, and fogged London streets and rooms where a single lamp holds back the dark. When you are awake and feel inclined, you may leave a quiet word in the comments, perhaps telling me whom you suspected as the writer of the letter that knew the future, or from which city, which small night-lit room, you listened and let the rails carry you toward peaceful sleep. For now, there is only this: the room growing dimmer as the embers settle, the slow, dependable ticking of a clock somewhere just out of sight, and, very far away, the almost imagined note of a train whistle in the snow, thinning into silence until all that remains is warmth, breath, and rest.